Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back more than 4,000 years, to a land wrapped in sand and shimmering heat, where the Nile River rolls gently past golden fields and stone monuments point toward the sun. You're standing barefoot against damp earth as dark reeds sway beside you, fireflies flicker like tiny sparks, and the air smells faintly of mud and roasted barley. Pharaohs may order pyramids and armies, but here, by the river bank, the quieter heartbeat of Egypt begins. People gather to laugh, to drink, to argue, and yes, to invent something that no human had ever quite attempted before, the structured, deliberate pleasure of a board game. And you, lucky time traveler that you are, get to watch the very first dice-like sticks fall across the sand. You probably won't survive the mosquitoes, though. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling generous, drop your location and the local time in the comments so I can see who else is wandering through this late-night desert with us. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along the riverbank, listening. The night is noisy with frogs croaking and the occasional grumble of a crocodile somewhere deeper in the channel. But near the reeds you hear another sound, smooth wooden pieces scraping on board squares, young voices chattering in excitement. The Nile doesn't just feed Egypt with wheat and flax, it waters the human impulse to play, experiment, and structure leisure. Historians remind you that no civilization reaches its golden age by work alone. Even in societies grinding under labor quotas, harvest demands, and temple regulations, spare moments demand to be filled. In Egypt, those little gaps of time may have sparked something extraordinary, the earliest board games ever recorded in human history. Board games weren't random distractions, they became miniature rehearsals of life and death. You crouch low, watching children scratch grids into the sand with reeds. They drop pebbles into each square and move them along improvised tracks, laughing when opponents mess up. Their parents use smoother, polished versions, grids painted on shardboards of wood. You realize you're witnessing the origins of patterns that will echo through human culture thousands of years later in things as varied as chess, Monopoly, and Candy Crush. Every time you roll dice in a modern dorm room or argue about house rules in Scrabble, you're reenacting some variation of this riverside Egyptian impulse, turning chaos into rules, and rules into fun. Now, here's the mainstream historical anchor. Archaeologists have found that some of the very earliest confirmed Egyptian board games date to around 3100 BCE. Senet, the superstar of these amusements, appears in tomb paintings of the Old Kingdom. But before formal boards appeared, scholars argue something quieter had to unfold, simple experiments in scratches, pebbles, maybe games of chase with rules no one bothered to write down. Historians still argue whether formal board games in Egypt evolved directly from earlier ritual divination tools or whether they grew from children's improvisations that somehow stuck in cultural memory. Your nose twitches at the smoky scent of fish roasting nearby. A group of adults sits cross-legged, and one of them, rather dramatically, raises for palm sticks, each polished and cut flat on one side. He tosses them into the air. They clatter against a board marked with small squares. Some land with flat sides up, some curved. The group erupts with groans and triumphant laughter. Suddenly you realize, you're watching chance itself being domesticated. These bits of wood are not random debris, they're proto-dice, used to generate numbers for the game. Imagine how exciting it must have been, 5,000 years ago, to feel fortune's invisible hand revealed by something as tangible as falling sticks. It's like someone just invented Wi-Fi, but for fate. A quirky tidbit, Often missed outside academic circles, some Egyptologists argue that board games weren't just entertainment, they may have begun as part of drinking nights or seasonal festivals, when ordinary folk experimented with ritualized randomness between sips of beer. Excavations near workmen's villages at Deir el-Medina unearthed fragments of informal gaming boards alongside jars for brewing beer. So the world's first board game cafe? Possibly, minus the lattes and overpriced hummus plates. You lean closer as the pieces slide forward. A boy scowls at his bad luck, his rival smirks triumphantly. Already these games are training social skills, learning patience, strategy, calculated optimism. In a world where the Nile could flood generously or ruinously, the ability to manage chance must have felt vital. Playing with the gods of luck around the board prepared Egyptians for real-world uncertainties. You think of how modern psychologists argue play builds resilience. Well, ancient Egyptians were ahead of the curve, tuning children's brains to survive the whims of the river. Out that other early societies, Sumerians, Indus Valley people, were experimenting with play culture at similar times. But Egypt created a particularly visible and long-lasting relationship between games and both daily life and afterlife. It's not exaggeration to say Egyptians embedded board games in the DNA of their culture the same way they embedded bread, beer, and eternal stone monuments. You sneak into a mud brick hut, peering through cracks. Inside, by firelight, a family has scratched a 3x10 grid into clay. Small pebbles are scattered across its length. You've seen this exact pattern carved into limestone fragments displayed in modern museums. This wasn't the polished artifact of a royal tomb, this was the household version. The poor plaster their floors with gaming squares just as much as nobles in palaces. It's a cultural thread binding every level of society. The mother wins 3 rounds in a row, and the others groan. She grins smugly, and even the father doesn't mind being bested. That's the power of the game. Modern scholars still puzzle about rules. Some sets show 20 squares, others 30. Some depict hieroglyphs suggesting magical layers. Did you need a balance of luck plus skill, or mostly luck? Historians still argue whether Senet was first a casual race game that only later grew mystical or whether it was always infused with cosmic overtones. You realize that every time you roll a die today and mutter, "Come on, lucky 6, you're essentially conversing with the same intangible forces the Egyptians codified in their games. You feel the breeze shift. A hippo snorts from the water. Someone laughs nervously, the group shifts slightly away from the river's edge. But the boards stay planted firmly in the sand, because no wild animal can scare Egyptians away from their chance to tilt destiny. This stubbornness in play mirrors their stubbornness in architecture, engineering, and ritual. They loved rules and order, but always wrapped in a teasing flirtation with chance. What about fringe speculations? One idea claims games like Senet might first emerge as mnemonic devices for teaching astronomy. Imagine the sequence of squares symbolizing moon cycles. Then as people fiddled with them more casually, they transitioned into amusements. It's not mainstream, but it tickles the imagination. You picture priests by the Nile using pebbles to mark star risings for calendar training, then someone's kid sneaks in, rolls a stick, and invents move 3 squares forward. Boom! Astronomy lesson mutated into playtime. The night deepens, stars shimmer overhead. You tilt your head back and notice Orion rising. Egyptians looked at these stars and saw Osiris the god, locked in eternal battle and rebirth. Is it coincidence, then, that their board games soon become metaphors for the journey of the soul? Maybe not. Already, in these casual beginnings, you sense something deeper. Egyptians regarded life and afterlife as continuous journeys, not switched destinies. Their games, with paths forward and backward, with chances to fall behind or leap ahead, seem like symbolic rehearsals of this eternal trek. A group of young men finish their match. The winner snatches a fragment of bread as a prize, laughing with his mouth full. Snacks as game rewards, a tradition clearly older than Doritos bribing your friends into another round of Monopoly. You realize we're looking at the cultural bedrock of competitive fun. By playing, Egyptians weren't wasting time, they were shaping a dynamic culture capable of mixing joy and seriousness. And then, almost invisibly, the board becomes sacred. Not tonight, not this instant, but you sense the drift. The little scratches in the mud harden into wooden panels, then luxury ivory inlays, then golden sets treasured in tombs. That's the timeline you'll wander through tonight. But it all begins here, on damp soil by the Nile, with humans simply deciding that play matters. As you rise, stretching your legs, you know you've just watched humanity's first steps toward a universal human instinct, codifying randomness into fun, shaping boredom into excitement, blending fate with friendship. And now, with the night deepening, you're ready to follow this playful impulse into the vast desert of history, where it will survive pyramids, dynasties, and time itself. You wander farther from the riverbank, brushing reeds off your clothes, until the land begins hardening into stone and sand. The cool dampness of the Nile gives way to a drier stillness, where the horizon holds not just the shimmer of stars but the squat shoulders of pyramids. In the moonlight, you see walls carved with stories, long lines of painted figures, musicians, ox herds, and fishermen preserved for eternity. But hidden among these grand narratives, tucked into quiet spaces on limestone walls and splashed across wooden coffins, lies something unexpected, the unmistakable image of rectangles divided into neat grids. It is Senet, the celestial superstar of Egyptian board games, immortalized right there beside gods and kings. Your eyes adjust. In one painting within the tomb of Queen Nefertari, the queen herself is seated delicately before a Senet board, her fingers poised above the squares. She's not harvesting wheat or commanding servants. She's gaming at the very threshold of eternity. And that's where you realize, Egyptians didn't only play Senet on lazy evenings after work, they carried it, symbolically, into the afterlife. If a board game shows up in tomb art, it's not just for fun, it's for forever. Now, here comes the firm historical anchor. Senet is the earliest documented board game on Earth that we can reasonably track with both physical boards and illustrated references, dating back more than 5,000 years. Archaeologists have recovered dozens of Senet sets, wooden boards, sometimes ivory inlays, carved squares nearly always in a 3x10 format. The tomb of Tutankhamun contained at least 4 gaming boxes, resplendent in gold and prized so much they sat alongside jewelry and weapons. To the Egyptians, Senet wasn't trivial, it was sacred enough to follow them into the dark. But the roots seem casual, the same rectangular boards carved into poor households' plaster walls that you peeked at by firelight in Section 1. Play began as recreation, then transformed into a vehicle for explaining and enacting cosmic order. Historians still argue whether the leap from casual pastime to spiritual ritual happened in the Old Kingdom, circa 2600 BCE, or took hold later, perhaps in the New Kingdom. That gap in opinion remains tantalizing. Some scholars think Senet's divine symbolism was there from its inception, while others believe it was only in its afterlife phase that it acquired metaphysical weight. You duck into a painting hall, flickering torchlight guiding your eyes over walls. You see painted grids set between the outstretched hands of figures depicted mid-move. A pharaoh frowns with concentration, his opponent a goddess perhaps, suggesting that play blurred between mortals and immortals. To our modern sensibilities, this might feel like combining Uno and Sunday Mass. But for ancient Egyptians, fusing entertainment with ritual wasn't strange, it was the glue of existence. Here's a quirky tidbit most bedtime listeners won't have heard: some Senet boards actually doubled as container boxes. They had sliding drawers below the grid, where players stored their pieces and gaming sticks. Think of it like ancient Egyptian board game merch. It's a travel set, the deluxe collector's edition, with custom storage. Tutankhamun's collection even hints that the young king adored high-quality game gear. And for people who barely had clay bowls for food, playing boards that luxurious might have felt like glimpsing heaven itself. Your mind drifts to the symbolic function. Egyptians believed Senet tracked a player's soul through the perils of the netherworld, finally reaching safe rest in Osiris's realm. Every throw of the sticks mapped the uncertainty of death's passage, the setbacks, the leaps forward, the terrifying reversals. You imagine rolling badly meant your soul stumbled into chaos for a moment, before recovering. Playing Senet wasn't just playful leisure, it was a simulation of judgment, a preparation for existential risk. Suddenly, each move carried cosmic echoes. Historians still argue whether the symbolic version of Senet fully overlapped with the commoner's casual games. Was Grandma Hetafers in her mud brick house really thinking about the field of reeds after she won 3 rounds against the neighbors, or was that reserved for royal priests? Scholars disagree. It's possible the game lived 2 lives in parallel, fun and fate, domestic and divine. That paradox, of course, is pure Egypt, a culture famous for fusing earthly noise with eternal silence, beer mugs with burial rites. Imagine the boards themselves, smooth slabs of wood, 30 rectangles lined in 10 rows of 3. Game pieces shaped like cones and spools sometimes orbited the grid. Collector's sets sparkled with ivory dots and ebony trim. Some boards had inscriptions, hieroglyphs calling on gods or invoking safe passage. You put your hand on an inlaid square where a hieroglyph reads House of Rebirth. Picture it, you rolling moves into that space, praying you can reposition your soul into safety. The goosebumps you feel are the same ones players might have felt thousands of years earlier. A fringe theory pops up in some corners: Senet wasn't always strictly competitive. Could it have been a cooperative game? A ritual where 2 players staged the struggle of life and afterlife for community education? Imagine how different gaming nights would feel if you and your buddy weren't trying to destroy each other's pawns but acting out a drama of cosmic escape together. Most evidence leans on competition, but playing with that cooperative cosmos theory is itself a philosophical game. Let's lighten this. Picture 2 Egyptian workers after a sweaty harvest shift. They sit by lamplight, sipping barley beer that tastes like sour porridge. One slams his cone piece triumphantly onto the last square. The other groans, tips back his drink, and mutters something unprintable in Middle Egyptian. Human behavior doesn't change: smack talk, bias, silly rituals for good luck. You can almost hear him say, "I knew I shouldn't have trusted those sticks." A joke carried across 4,500 years is still recognizable game night frustration. But the stakes in Tumart are higher. For nobles, triumph in Senet represented the certainty of entering the afterlife without disruption. Losing wasn't just an annoyance, it was an omen of potential stumbling in death. That dual layer of meaning is what makes Senet such a rich symbol, trivial in the hut, monumental in the sarcophagus. Modern games rarely balance that scale. Monopoly doesn't usually determine salvation, though it sometimes feels like eternal damnation when you're stuck for hours. Archaeologists tracking Senet boards across dynasties note subtle shifts. Early boards look plain, But after the New Kingdom, around 1500 BCE, designs grow ornate and inscriptions more spiritual. The game formally merges with religious texts, echoing spells of the Book of the Dead. In some sets, boards even carve out distinct danger and safe zones near the final few squares, visualizing hurdles like water, chaos, or evil serpents that the soul has to navigate. If you ever wondered what a video game boss level might look like in antiquity, the last stretch of a Senet board was basically that, one final scary obstacle before victory meant eternal bliss. As you step back, the tomb walls glow faintly. Paintings of pharaohs playing look serene, but they hide tension. For the deceased, including such imagery was insurance, a prayer disguised as play. Laser-bright echoes of eternity slip between the carved squares. You get the sense that Egyptians knew full well life was fragile, precarious. And what better way to train for fragility than rolling fate across a gridded board? So here you are, crouching in a tomb filled with silence and torch smoke, tracing Senet boards left for eternity. You realize you're not just witnessing playtime. This is where humans invented the uncanny fusion of game and religion. Egypt ensured that in between monumental architecture and cosmic myths, simple fun found room on the walls and in the hearts of players. Senet, the board of fate, whispers across 3 millennia and through these walls to remind you or play, even when sacred, is always play. You shuffle your feet across dusty limestone, leaving the painted tomb chamber behind. The images of Senet boards linger in your mind like flickering after images, but a sly question rises in your head: how on earth was this game actually played? The Egyptians left us walls full of scenes, pharaohs leaning thoughtfully over grids, gods reaching toward carved boards, but strangely, nobody bothered to scribble the rules down. The world's earliest board game comes to us wrapped in silence. You glance at the wooden grids in museum cases today, at the cone-shaped or spool-shaped pawns lined up like tiny armies, and you've got to admit, it looks great, but without instructions, it's a cosmic Sudoku puzzle with half the numbers erased. That's the crux of Section 3. Senet might be the crown jewel of board game history, yet the precise rules are a playground for speculation. Archaeologists have reconstructed possibilities, historians have written competing manuals, and graduate students have tested guesswork in dorm lounges. But to this day, nobody knows the official game of eternity. You reach a half-collapsed storage chamber behind a temple ruin. Sand covers a cracked board on the floor, 30 squares in 3 rows, still faint beneath the dust. You brush it with your hand, listening to the faint clink of tiny pebbles falling away. This is where your imagination and scholarship partner. Mainstream historians speculate that players each began with roughly 5 to 7 pieces lined up on one side of the board. The goal may have been to race them across the 30 squares, moving forward according to throws of sticks or later dice-like knucklebones. So far, so recognizable, you've basically invented an ancient cousin of backgammon or parcheesi. But the Egyptian version was layered with hazards, squares near the end bore symbols that could hurl you backward, trap you, or demand certain rolls to escape. Playing meant both skill and surrender, anticipating strategy while bowing to fate's chaotic shrug. The evidence? Tomb inscriptions and boards carved with specific square markings, a water sign at square 27, often interpreted as drowning, translation in cosmic terms, danger of chaos. A hieroglyph of repetition around square 28, hinting you may have to replay or repeat steps. Square 29 often marked House of Three Truths, possibly requiring an exact throw, echoing the final judgment. Square 30, the House of Rebirth, symbolized safe escape into the afterlife. So though you can't read the rules line by line, you detect a narrative arc, struggle, peril, spiritual triumph. Senet wasn't just a race, it was myth in motion. And here's where human frustration comes in. You can picture 2 New Kingdom Egyptians seated across a board, their friends yelling advice from behind. One player reaches the dreaded water square, his pawn stuck. The audience groans, maybe jokes about him drowning in beer instead. Ancient play was never stiff, laughter must have rolled across Nile courtyards just as it does during modern family game nights. Now insert the scholarly brawl. Historians still argue whether the sticks always functioned as binary throws, flat side up equals 1, curved side up equals 0, or whether pieces moved by cumulative values based on how many flat sides landed. Was it like tossing coins or closer to rolling dice? Some boards also came with knucklebones from animals, hinting at dice being alternatives. That's like discovering a Monopoly board beside a D20 die. Future archaeologists would be equally confused. Did Egyptians swap house rules like modern players? Possibly. Imagine noble households inventing tweaks. Oh, in this palace version, you have to circle 3 times, not once. Chaos disguised as order fits ancient Egypt beautifully. A quirky tidbit, some experiments suggest Senet might last hours. Certain combinations of unlucky rolls kept pawns bouncing in traps near the endgame, prolonging agony. So if you felt tortured by a 3-hour Monopoly stalemate, just know Egyptians were suffering the same fate millennia ago. Eternal life apparently demanded eternal patience. As you hold a piece in your palm, it gleams with ancient polish, a tiny ivory cone, smoothed by generations of fingers. You feel the weight of ordinary competition but also sacred rehearsal. Egyptians may have taught children to play Senet not just for fun, but to prepare them for the metaphorical journey beyond. After all, if you could master bad rolls and still escape, maybe you'd survive the real afterlife obstacles. Think of it as a dangerous classroom disguised as a cozy pastime. Fringe speculation abounds. What if Senet wasn't a race game alone? Some argue it doubled as a divination tool, where throws foretold luck or answered yes-no questions from gods. Say someone asked whether a harvest would succeed this year, they'd throw sticks, move pieces, and interpret whether they landed in safer squares. Over time, this divination might have produced permanent rules, creating gameplay. Kind of like if tarot fortune-telling mutated into poker. Not universally accepted, but the thought adds a mystical flavor every time you watch pawns leap across ancient boards. But you know what's both hilarious and comforting? Even lacking written rules, people today keep reinventing them. Archaeologists in the 20th century drafted models, then tested them by playing with colleagues late into the night. Some claimed Senet was 90% luck, others argued strategy dominated. There are even tournaments now where players race on reconstructed boards, arguing fiercely over whose rule set is most authentic. So, in perfect irony, the living tradition of arguing about board game rules goes back 5,000 years. Humans never change. Let's pause for the sensory picture again. You, under torchlight, kneeling over a replica Senet board. Across from you sits an Egyptian farmer in a linen kilt, his brow sweaty, his knuckles tapping impatiently. You toss for flat sticks, 2 land flat, 2 curved. According to one reconstructed set of rules, that means a move of 2. You slide your pawn forward, grin smugly. Then he throws, all for curved, they count as 5. He leaps past you with a roar of victory. That sound, half laughter, half boast, crosses time more clearly than any hieroglyph. And yet, the uncertainty nags you. Unlike chess, whose rules leap intact across the centuries, Senet resists fossilization. Some archaeologists even argue that each region may have had slightly different house rules, never codified universally. Which means, we may never truly recover the authentic version. Senet, like the Nile itself, keeps shifting course. Still, that's not a loss, it's a gift. Because in its ambiguity, Senet allows you to imagine, to play a little archaeology of the soul. It teaches that not all history is about pinning down answers, sometimes it's about enjoying the fact we'll never fully solve the puzzle. That's appropriate for a civilization obsessed with mystery, secrecy, and eternity. As you leave the cracked chamber and step back into the starlit desert, the Senet board glowing faintly behind you, the silence is oddly soothing. Egyptians devised a game to mirror life's uncertainty, and fittingly, we remain uncertain about the game itself. You can grin at the irony. Maybe that was their final joke on history, leaving us to play without knowing the exact rules. After all, isn't that what life feels like? You walk deeper into the desert night, sand sticking to your ankles, the breeze carrying hints of burning resin from some distant temple. You can almost hear the dull slap of palm stick throws echoing down the centuries, those strange clattering sounds that gave board games their pulse. If the board's grid was the map, and the pawns were the travelers, then the sticks were the voice of fate itself. You crouch as a family gathers around a low board, and, with theatrical flourish, the eldest tosses for slim casting sticks. They tumble through air, hit the board with a sharp crack, and land unevenly, some flat, some rounded. Everyone leans forward as though the gods themselves just whispered. This isn't just probability. For ancient Egyptians, it was a divine roll of fate. You feel the tension in the air. The Egyptians never separated chance from destiny. To them, randomness was a signal from higher powers. The sticks, or later dice-shaped knucklebones, weren't mere tools, they were channels. Every throw teased out Osiris's will, every count of 2 or 5's a cosmic verdict, not just a friendly nudge around the board. And that heavy resonance lingers. You get the sense that when you drop your own dice on modern tables, you're echoing this same conversation with the unseen, whether you mean to or not. Here's the mainstream grounding. Senet boards often came with distinctive sets of forecasting sticks, carved wood polished flat on one side and rounded on the reverse. The combination of upward faces after each throw produced numbers, probably 1 through 5. Later, in Hellenistic Egypt, dice shaped like cubes from knucklebones appeared more commonly. But early game kit indicates palm sticks were the primary medium for randomness. Their simplicity belies immense significance. Egyptologists even point out that certain tomb paintings depict gods handing sticks to pharaohs, underlining that destiny itself was delivered by divine hand. Imagine the moment your pawn inches closer to the house of rebirth. You throw the sticks nervously. Land the wrong combination, and you could be knocked back into metaphorical chaos. Roll the right one, and your soul walks free into the afterlife. You can practically hear players mutter whispered prayers while casting, equal parts superstition and strategy. Here's a quirky tidbit worth savoring. In some periods, the throwing of sticks was surrounded by chanting or little invocations, like micro-rituals before each cast. Some scholars suggest players may have believed they could sway outcomes with words, or through charms placed on the table. That's essentially the world's earliest example of the lucky dice roll. Flash forward a few millennia and gamblers knock on wood, blow on dice, or chant silly rhymes before rolling at casinos. Turns out human superstition travels farther than armies or trade caravans. Now, historians still argue whether Egyptians thought skill mattered on top of luck. Was clever piece movement enough to offset unlucky throws, or did the gods roll overrule mortal cunning entirely? Some argue the board required genuine position strategy, protecting pawns, creating blockades, anticipating opponent moves. Others think chance dwarfed everything. This debate cuts to the heart of Egyptian worldview. Did humans truly steer their lives, or were they passengers beneath cosmic forces? The sticks, scattered across the board, became a miniature answer to the eternal question. You smile imagining the mix of casual fun and divine reverence. Picture 2 workers under the shade of a sycamore, playing at lunchtime. One groans after 3 bad throws and curses his rotten fortune. The other chuckles and quips, "Ra must not like you today." What might sound like a joke still frames random chance as godly whim. Families brought fate into their lap and laughed at it, even while quietly respecting it. The tactile feel of the sticks would have sealed the experience. Smooth, slightly sticky from palm wood oils. You can sense the quiet satisfaction of tossing them, hearing the abrupt clatter louder than the desert crickets. Play is sensory, not just the sight of pawns gliding but the sound of luck colliding with earth. That clatter is history's very first sound of dice, the moment human society dared invite chaos indoors as controllable ritual. Here's a fun aside. Some ethnographers compare these Egyptian casting sticks to African mancala seeds or Polynesian stick games, noting how physical manipulation of everyday objects often becomes a portal to the divine. The Egyptians just formalized it spectacularly. Your humble handful of wooden slats suddenly dictated eternity. Fringe speculation suggests that early priests may have used the same casting sticks for oracles far beyond games. Imagine a farmer asking whether the flood would be generous this year. Instead of going to a seer, he might toss for sticks, counting the way they land, like an agricultural magic 8-ball. Over time, casual street versions shed the divinatory pretext and solidified into pure entertainment. This possibility thrills you, because then every Senet match still contains a shadow of prophecy, even if players swore they were just having fun. Torchlight flickers along temple columns as you imagine priests throwing sticks in front of a shrine, interpretation scrawled onto leaves or whispered as warnings. Now place that next to kids on the floor of a courtyard, giggling when one gets sent back to the water square. Sacred destiny and childish teasing walked hand in hand. And perhaps that reconciliation of cosmic weight with laughter is what made Egyptians human and lovable across millennia. Of course, reconstructing the scoring system is where scholars nearly pull their hair out. Some theories. 1 flat side up equals move 1 step, 2 equals move 2, and so on. All for curved sides facing down equals 5, treated as the luckiest throw. Some rule sets gave bonuses for perfect throws, letting you take another turn. So if you think scratching out Monopoly's free parking rule is confusing, imagine archaeologists 3,000 years from now piecing it together with no written manual. That's exactly what Senet gifts to us, a set of permanent mysteries, like riddles carved in wood. As you recline against cool stone, you realize something. These small sticks baking in Egyptian sun embody one of humanity's most intimate breakthroughs, turning randomness into ritual game mechanics. No longer was fate some distant storm or Nile flood alone. You could touch it, toss it, measure your luck in tidy numbers, and move your pawn accordingly. It gave people psychological rehearsal for the randomness of living itself. It made mortality feel, if not beatable, at least playable. The sticks lie silent after the last throw. Around you, the desert hums quietly, frogs croak distantly, constellations glitter overhead. You wipe dust from your knees, thinking about the countless hands that tossed wood for luck. They laughed, they argued, they prayed. And every time they cast those tiny slats of palm, they believed, if only for a second, that the universe itself had spoken. You wander further along the ridge of sand, watching as the Nile curves back into view under the pale shimmer of moonlight. The chatter of dice, well, sticks and bones, is fading behind you, but your ears catch another hum, something more intimate, almost domestic. It's the music of ordinary families gathered in their mud brick homes, lamps guttering with smoke, chatter mixing with the smell of steaming barley beer. Here you step into the quieter truth. Games in ancient Egypt didn't just belong to priests or pharaohs. They lived in kitchens, on porches, and under shade trees in workmen's villages. They became the after-dinner diversion as much as a cosmic symbol. Yet in the Egyptian imagination, nothing stayed small. Even family play spilled seamlessly into the afterlife, until the act of moving tokens on wooden boards became an eternal rehearsal for immortality. You see it written in both clay shards and hieroglyphs. The same scratches that entertained the living were carried by the dead. Let's anchor ourselves with the historical record. Archaeologists excavating at workers' settlements, like Deir el-Medina near Thebes, frequently find fragmentary game boards scratched into limestone flakes and broken pottery shards. They're crude, just a few lines scratched into plaster, yet they mirror the same grids we know from high-class Senet boards. This suggests workers, craftsmen, even children in the humblest houses regularly played. Leisure in ancient Egypt was layered. Royal courts had golden boxes and ivory pawns, while ordinary labours had dirt-drawn grids with pebbles. But the game experience remained essentially the same. Nothing demonstrates cultural universality better than beer-soaked laughter around a board in both palace and hut. Now tilt your eyes back toward tombs. Paintings frequently depict the deceased sitting before Senet boards in banquet scenes. A man holds the sticks in hand. Onlookers sit around as if cheering him through his final match before eternity. That overlap is crucial. Egyptians didn't segregate playtime and religion. Instead, daily activities often transitioned immediately into sacred metaphors. Eating bread became offering. Drinking beer became festival ritual. Playing a board game became reenacting the soul's perilous path through the underworld. This cultural habit of layering is what allowed Senet to glide from family fun into burial chambers. For Egyptians, what you did daily prepared you for eternity. Historians still argue whether those tomb boards were intended as actual playable equipment buried for ghostly leisure, or whether they symbolized eternal victory already achieved. One school of thought sees the buried board as a tool for the Ka, the spirit double, who might actually pass the afterlife hours playing. Another interpretation imagines the board more like an icon, a magical placeholder, ensuring the owner's soul had already won Senet's spiritual contest. You scratch your chin at the paradox. Maybe truth lies between that objects could both serve practical and symbolic functions. After all, often in Egypt, ritual blurred with practicality. Here's where things get quirky. Archaeological finds include children's miniature Senet sets carved in clay, sometimes unfinished, almost like prototypes. Egyptologists suggest boys and girls may have used little pocket versions as toys, kid-sized training boards. Picture it, kids crouched in dust, throwing crude dice, fighting over rules exactly as today's siblings do. The idea that the world's first shouting match between brothers over "no, you cheated" could have echoed here in 2000 BCE. Comforting and hilarious. Fun fact, one board was so roughly made it almost looked like a baker scratched lines into leftover clay when he was bored on the job. You realize, humans get distracted at work no matter the century. Now shift to the sense of continuity. For a head of household, teaching children Senet wasn't just filling idle time. It instilled spatial reasoning, patience, rule following, but also spiritual rehearsal. Win or lose, each game embodied lessons. Bad luck can humble you, clever choices sometimes save you, and fate always has the last say. When parents looked across the board at children, they weren't just teaching them to play, they were gently initiating them into Egypt's philosophy of living. You lean at an open doorway, peering into a flickering room. Inside, a grandmother plays against her daughter and grandson. The child slaps his pawn down too hard, she clicks her tongue, scoops his piece, and declares him banished to the water square. Laughter erupts. The boy pouts, his mother consoles him, the game continues. Now stop and think, the exact hieroglyph for square 27, the dreaded water trap, carried heavy connotations of chaos threatening the soul's journey. Yet here, in the casual banter of a family game, that dark symbol became warm humor to tease a child. It's the Egyptian genius, making eternity playful, weaving teaching moments into daily chuckles. Let's not forget another layer, festivals. Secular and ritual celebrations often included drinking games, music, and dance. It's entirely plausible that group matches of Senet or other board games took place during festivals, perhaps outside temple precincts under starlight. Contemplate a lantern-lit gathering where families laid cheap boards on mats, played rounds while beer flowed, music drifted, neighbors looked on. People likely wagered tokens of bread or jewelry, stirring the excitement. Gaming spilled outdoors, mixing with the scents of grilled fish and roasted duck. This communal picture stands in fascinating contrast to solemn tomb scenes. You see again how the same game could stretch across multiple registers, laughter in the courtyard one day, immortality rehearsal the next. Here's a mainstream fact. Written texts like the Book of the Dead explicitly link Senet passages with the journey of the soul. At one point, Senet was even called the game of passing. In this conception, each successful move of a pawn symbolized safe progress past demons and obstacles guarding the underworld. Board squares became checkpoints on a cosmic race course. And here's a quirky example of daily blurring. Archaeologists found graffiti scratched into limestone at Deir el Medina showing informal grids resembling Senet, but adjacent to notes about rations or deliveries. Picture a scribe doodling a Senet board while keeping track of supplies, as if someone jotted tic-tac-toe during a boring lecture. This happened 3,000 years before high schoolers doodled game boards in notebooks. Some things never change. Historians still debate an even deeper layer. Was Senet also thought of as a literal gateway, an interdimensional portal board? Some esoteric theories suggest Egyptians could meditate on game movements as a ritual launching pad to experience afterlife visions even before death. Others dismiss that as New Age projection. But still, the carvings of gods and sacred inscriptions hovering near boards invite the wondering. Imagine, you place a pawn into the final square, House of Rebirth. You don't just win. You spiritually become reborn in miniature. You grant your future self a symbolic passport stamped by gameplay. That's why boards don't rot tucked away, they're spiritually loaded equipment. Seen this way, your afterlife suitcase had bread, beer, amulets, and, naturally, a good gaming set. Because what's eternity without something to play? Yet pause, because the irony runs deep. Scholars often point out how Egyptians were terrified of unpredictability, the Nile's floods, disease, invasion. Their culture built systems of order, to fence off chaos. What better training tool than a board game where fate could ambush you at any moment? To make randomness a household activity was a subtle therapy, blunting its sting with laughter. If you could lose well at Senet, maybe you could survive the Nile's cruelty, some anthropologists propose. It's a neat twist, family fun as spiritual resilience training. The night is cooling, and you step into another house. The head of the family sits before a modest board, already arranging pawns after dinner. Beside him, a younger sibling watches closely, learning the ways. Their pieces are no gold, just chipped stone cones. The sticks are crudely carved reeds. But the seriousness in their expression matches any royal chamber. This game prepares me for more than tomorrow's work, the father might say. It prepares me for the eternal river. Even if he never voiced it out loud, the act itself laid the groundwork. Egypt's genius was not just to invent complex architecture or maintain state ideologies, it was to make cosmic rehearsal accessible, showing up in kitchen corners and neighborhood mats. To modern eyes, it underscores how deeply they blurred secular and sacred. There was no firm wall separating just fun with kids from soul initiation. Everything in Egypt was training for eternity, whether baking bread, plowing soil, or rolling sticks on a carved board. So as you finally step back toward the starlit street, the hum of boards clicking behind you, you realize the Nile world held no distinction between play and prayer. It was just living. Families taught survival, resilience, and comfort through games, then packed those same boards in the tomb to ensure the dead carried fun and safety onward. Life never ended at dusk, it simply continued on another board, across another realm. You follow a winding path now, leaving the simple glow of village lamps behind and climbing toward something far shinier, heavier, and more dramatic. The ground crunches under your sandals, and then suddenly, you stop dead still. The light of the moon has caught on a glittering edge of gold leaf, a gilded corner peeking out of a shadowy burial chamber doorway. You duck inside, and your breath evaporates. Spread across the chamber are wonders that once belonged to kings, thrones glinting with intricate inlays, alabaster jars, weapons polished to gleam, and gleaming in softer corners, game boards that look as though they might still be waiting for their royal owner to return for one more match. Tonight you are staring squarely at the most extravagant upgrade in gaming history, the golden Senet sets of pharaohs, treasures so valued they were buried in tombs alongside crowns, scepters, and curved khopesh swords. Pharaoh Tutankhamun's tomb is the superstar case. Discovered intact in 1922, it astonished the modern world with not just lavish jewelry, thrones, and statues, but also for gaming sets. Some were chest-like boxes inlaid with ivory and precious stones, each with sliders and compartments to hold sticks and pawns. Others were double-sided, one side laid out for Senet, another for another racing game possibly related to 20 squares. These weren't idle trinkets, they were luxury objects signaling how important board play was to Egyptian kings. If a pharaoh needed only a few items for eternity, alongside protective amulets and sacred scrolls, a good game set made the cut. Now think, Tutankhamun was barely 18 when he died. For somebody so young, Senet may have been both personal pastime and ritual guarantee. Historians still argue whether he himself regularly played for fun or whether the tomb sets were symbolic offerings from priests attempting to ensure his cosmic passage. But either way, to be buried with 4 sets shows weight. If today you were entombed with your Xbox and Switch, archaeologists 3,000 years later might conclude gaming defined your very identity. Let's step aside from Tut for a moment. Other royal tombs have yielded similar finds, elaborate boards for Hatshepsut's officials, fine inlays found among the burials of nobles at Thebes. These were statements. In elite culture, a decorated Senet set wasn't just entertainment, it was status, taste, spiritual insurance, and wealth rolled into one. Gold corners, ebony surfaces, ivory pegs, it was the Rolex of leisure. Imagine visiting a banquet and pulling out your travel-size Senet set for friends, ivory pawns that glowed in the torchlight, playing sticks polished so slick they practically whistled through the air. People likely gasped and whispered about your rank. And yet, quirky fact, some of these deluxe sets doubled as backgammon-like boards for another game on the reverse. Egyptologists marvel, luxury owners wanted versatility too. So one side resembled Senet's 3x10 grid, the other the Mesopotamian game of 20 squares. Think of it as a royal 2-for-1. Practical, stylish, and spiritually loaded. Pharaohs were collectors like us, unwilling to travel light, especially into the afterlife. You lean closer and imagine an Egyptian king hunched in private, perhaps Tut himself as a teenager with his queen Ankhesenamun at his side, shifting golden pawns under lamplight. The image is warming. Kingship was exhausting, filled with rituals, politics, and war treaties. But in the quiet of the palace, he may have found the same simple joy as any villager laughing in the marketplace. These shimmering boards unified genders, classes, and roles. Beneath the gold leaf and ivory, the action was identical: roll, move, groan, triumph. Mainstream factor ground us. The tomb of Tutankhamun actually contained a Senet box carved from ivory and ebony, featuring drawers beneath to organize sticks and pawns. Some sides of these boxes bore inscriptions linked to afterlife journeys. This wasn't just bling, it was metaphysical engineering cast in precious materials. To modern curators, the survival of these artifacts offers tangible evidence of just how central games ranked in elite spirituality. Now, here's a fringe speculation that makes you raise an eyebrow. Some writers propose that kings might have used Senet symbolically as both a statecraft metaphor and divination tool. A pharaoh tossing sticks could see moves reflecting upcoming harvest prosperity or military campaigns. Rulers using leisure for political prophecy? It's unproven, bordering on imaginative, but consider this: Egyptians collapsed personal ritual with governance in many ways. Pharaohs were living gods, after all. Why not divine through golden games? You run your hand close, but not on the inlaid gold decoration. Imagine how heavy and dignified those boards must have felt, compared to clay scratch-outs in workmen's houses. The class divide in ancient Egypt was monumental, yet one thing bridged it: the same rules of play. Whether you were a fisherman's child tracing grids with a stick or the king surrounded by piles of treasure, your pawn couldn't move without a lucky throw. Fate humbled everyone. Even gold pieces weren't immune to the water square disaster. But don't imagine pharaohs never fought over the outcome. Picture young Tutankhamun having a bad streak while playing late at night. His queen smirks, leaning on her elbow, waiting for his doom tumble into chaos. An irritated teen pharaoh slams the sticks down louder than necessary. Servants likely shuffled nervously nearby. What do you do when your god king loses his temper over dice? Humor him, probably. Pharaoh sulking because Senet hates him, that's history's most relatable gaming table tantrum. Quirky aside, Egyptologists have noted that some ornate boards in museums show clear wear on certain squares. Even ornate, gold-trimmed toys got actual use, not just ceremonial placement. Royal fingers really did clack pieces back and forth. In other words, luxury never stopped the urge to actually play. That humanizing detail makes you grin. Pharaohs, they're just like us. But here lies a debate: did these royal sets reflect genuine recreation, or had they become purely ceremonial by burial time? Some scholars argue that enough markings and hieroglyphs on the ending squares point to heavily ritualized versions reserved for afterlife pedagogy, essentially teaching the soul how to journey forward. Others counter the visible scuff marks suggest constant, casual use in palaces before being carefully packed with the king. Historians still argue whether games were dual-purpose, toggling freely between entertainment and devotion, or whether a strictly sacred branch of Senet emerged at the higher social levels. That ambiguity stays unresolved. You glance around Tutankhamun's chamber again. Swords beside gaming boxes, perfume oils beside shields, jewelry beside game pawns. It strikes you that Egyptians defined eternal identity through a balance of war, style, and play. Eternity demanded both strength and gamesmanship. The presence of boards here testifies how much the practice followed them beyond tomb walls. Death threatened randomness, and what tool better expressed Egyptian dialogues with randomness than a good set of sticks and squares? Even the treasure hoard context underscores something essential. Egyptians recognized that the afterlife was a journey. Just like pawns crawling across 30 squares toward the house of rebirth, the soul crept through risks toward blessed rest. Gold boards weren't just playthings, they were symbolic roadmaps, like packing Google Maps for the field of reeds. The point wasn't idle fun. It was to take the game as a visual and tactile rehearsal so that Death's Passage felt like familiar territory. Another perspective for fun, in some modern Egyptian museums, you'll see replicas of Tut's gaming sets in the gift shop. Visitors stare at glass casings, then buy cardboard knockoffs to carry home in suitcases. Suddenly you see the full circle. 4,000 years later, we still crave the same pattern of fusing play with ritual, decoration with recreation. Except today's travelers get board games wrapped in shrink wrap, not gold. And yet, the symbolism remains. Play matters enough to represent your culture to the world. You step outside, blinking against starlight. The tomb behind you holds boards that dazzled Europe's imagination after Howard Carter's discovery. But deeper truth shines through the spectacle. No matter how extravagant, those golden Senet sets operated on the same rules as scratched courtyard versions. Pharaohs and peasants alike sat, laughed, rolled, and groaned at fate. Egyptians put joy in rules, and rules into forever. As the night air cools, you imagine those golden boards gleaming faintly in eternal dark, pieces waiting to be moved again. Kings may have melted away, dynasties collapsed, pyramids looted. But the boards remain like sleeping guardians, reminding you that even the mightiest rulers of history trusted a board game to carry them through eternity. You leave behind the glitter and hush of Tutankhamun's gold chambers, the weight of pharaohs and the smell of resin and cedarwood, and turn your gaze outward, far beyond Egypt's borders. The desert opens wide, and you imagine caravans moving like lines of ants across vast sand seas, donkey bells clinking, merchants carrying obsidian blades, Syrian cedar, African ebony, and sacks of spices. Yet hidden among all these wares, cultural cargo flows more quietly. You realize an odd thing: Egypt wasn't the only land bitten by the gaming bug. Across rivers in Mesopotamia and on trade ports sailing the Mediterranean, neighbors too sat hunched over boards, rolling dice and smirking at each other. Tonight, you test a daring idea whispered among historians. What if Senet was not just Egypt's pleasure, but a grandfather that inspired a web of later games, ancestors leading eventually to backgammon? The evidence first, in the Mesopotamian city of Ur. Archaeologists unearthed in the 1920s a stunning artifact now known as the Royal Game of Ur. It dates to around 2600 BCE, overlapping with Egypt's Old Kingdom. This game employed a 20-square board with a bold decorative design, including rosettes marking special spots. With tetrahedral dice and a mixture of racing luck and strategy, it bears strong resemblance to the racing structure of Senet. Suddenly, you sense a possible family resemblance. Was something in the Bronze Age air encouraging all these civilizations to create race-to-the-finish board contests? Historians still argue whether there's a direct genetic line. Did an Egyptian merchant show a Mesopotamian trader his lucky Senet throw on a Nile dock, sparking a Sumerian workshop to fashion its own version? Or did societies independently invent racing games because of the universal appeal of chance and movement? The jury remains firmly undecided. But the temptation of a link is strong. Just look, both involve movement across tightly defined grids, both involve dice-style randomizers, both involve perilous squares requiring special rolls to pass. Coincidence or cultural diffusion? You scratch your chin like an archaeologist mid-lecture. Now here's the quirky detail. Some Senet boards found in Egypt actually had double sides, one for the traditional 30-square game, another with boards nearly identical to the Mesopotamian 20 squares. That screams cultural borrowing. Traders or conquerors may have introduced the variant, and elite Egyptians adapted it. This double-board design essentially meant ancient travel editions of board games contained multiple games in one box. Think of it as 2 games in one cartridge, the world's earliest multi-platform console. Elite Egyptians may have flexed by pulling out not just their own ancestral pastime but a fashionable import too. Picture a luxury feast, wealthy Egyptians leaning on low couches, fanning themselves lazily, and showing off their double-sided boards. Look, dear guests, we can play our native Senet, or, if you prefer foreign flair, here's the Mesopotamian race game version. Conversation dips into trade routes, marriages, wine shipments from byblows, and between bites of roasted goose, pawns clack steadily forward. There, in miniature, cultural globalization unfolds. Now straighten your posture because the scholarly debates are lively. Some Egyptologists argue fiercely against setting Senet in the backgammon lineage. They insist the resemblance is just convergent invention. You give dice to a society, they'll naturally invent race games. Others emphasize the multiple hybrid boards as proof of circulation. Historians still argue whether Senet was ancestor or simply cousin. But it's undeniable Egyptians participated in the Mediterranean melting pot of ideas, even when ideas came carved in wood with little drawers for pawns. Another fascinating thread, Greek and Roman authors centuries later described games resembling race boards. The Roman ludus duodecim scriptorum, game of 12 lines, an early relative of backgammon, echoes the same rhythm: dice rolls, piece races, blockades, escapes. Even if not direct descendants, the mechanical DNA seems similar. Roll, move, dodge danger, get out first. The world never tired of the formula. It's as universal as laughter. Let's ground this again with a solid fact. In Tutankhamun's tomb, board boxes doubling as 20 squares were indeed discovered, resembling nearly identical Mesopotamian artifacts. That's hard to shrug off as accident. If not direct parental descent, at least a lively neighborly conversation was happening across the ancient Near East. Merchants traded not only wine jars but fun. Quirky aside, some of the dice used for 20 squares looked suspiciously like knucklebones, the cleaned and carved ankle bones of sheep or goats. They clattered with unpredictable bounce. Egyptians, seeing these odd-shaped dice, may have chuckled at the foreign style, then adapted. The image of aristocrats gambling their cosmic afterlife on fragments of livestock bone is both hilarious and vivid. You can imagine a noble staring at a knucklebone and muttering, "The gods want me to bet my eternity on this." Then shrugging and rolling anyway. Fringe speculation dances around here too. A handful of scholars toy with the notion that Senet, Mehen, the serpent game you'll meet later, and foreign race games all belong to an ancient ritual package, teaching cycles of life, death, renewal, and cosmic struggle. Under this lens, their similarities weren't borrowed but reflected universal human mythopoetics. Humans love embedding life journeys in movement on boards. Snakes and ladders, Candyland, backgammon, all versions of life path. If so, Senet wasn't father to later games but part of one great human archetype always reincarnating in play. Still, you sense the very ambiguity delights scholars. Debating whether Senet directly influenced backgammon is itself a kind of game. They move evidence forward, counter with critiques, retreat strategies behind new finds. They throw the dice of interpretation, cheer when their theory lands safe. Historians, in that sense, are still playing Senet, even if pieces now are essays, conferences, and PowerPoint slides. Imagine, though, a caravan halting at a Sinai outpost, camel bells in chorus as traders unload. One guy pulls a wooden box from under a pack, flips open a drawer with pawns, and invites his Egyptian companion to play. They speak in fractured tongues, gesturing with hands, but the moments of luck and laughter flow perfectly. Rules teach themselves mid-game, no translation required. That's the power of simple dice race mechanics, they cross borders effortlessly. This is how globalization begins, not just with treaties, but with board games migrating across deserts on donkey backs. Another quirky human touch, think about gamblers. Wherever games cross cultures, gambling tags along like a shadow. Sumerians wagered tiny amounts of barley beer or trinkets, Egyptians likely did too. Suddenly the line between sacred Senet and profitable gaming blurred. Pharaohs may have disapproved, official rituals demanded reverence, but villagers likely whispered side bets anyway. Humans can't help it. If two pawns can race, wagers are natural. So in a dusty Levant tavern, two players bent over a hybrid board, arguing not only about the god's will but also who owes who another mug of beer. Ancient Las Vegas, minus Elvis impersonators. Let's circle back to the idea of backgammon's ancestry. Even if no direct bloodline connects Senet 3000 BCE to backgammon boards in Rome 2000 years later, their kinship of feeling is undeniable. When modern players slam down a doubling cube or curse dice that deny their escape, they echo Egyptians throwing palm sticks and groaning when pawns fell into water squares. The motion of pawns across structured squares against the clock of fate binds thousands of years. Senet may not have begotten backgammon, but it provided humanity's first draft of competitive randomness. The rest may be iterations. Historians delight in pointing out one lingering irony: no matter how luxurious Senet's corners, its rules are half lost. Meanwhile, the royal game of yore has more deciphered rules thanks to cuneiform instruction tablets. So ironically, a Mesopotamian cousin is better understood structurally. Egypt gave the world the flash, gold boards, tomb carvings, but left scholars grasping. Yore gave scribes who scribbled actual instruction. That frustration continues to fuel scholarly rivalries. As the desert winds cool, you gaze west toward Nile towers and east toward Euphrates plains. Senet boards glimmer with moonlight memory, Mesopotamian dice clatter faintly in your ears. You can imagine those moments, players trading rules over spice sacks, a child from Canaan watching both and creating yet another variant. Games didn't stay in one house, they migrated like seeds on sandals. Maybe Senet was backgammon's ancestor. Maybe not. But what's certain, it belongs to a first wave of human play culture that made chance, fate, and movement tangible across continents. Egypt produced its shining version, Mesopotamia produced rosettes, Greece refined stakes, Rome hardened formats, and centuries later you end up with a 24-point backgammon board on a cafe table in Istanbul. Echoes line up square after square, like pawns racing ever forward. You brush sand from your hands, smiling. Whether father, cousin, or just a parallel branch, Senet spilled into a global gaming family. And every roll since then, every tumble of dice, has been haunted by a golden board glimmering in a pharaoh's tomb. You slip speculation caravans around here and the foreign spice routes of a handful of scholars back into the notion that Senet, Mehen, the serpent game is quiet tonight, and foreign race shadow black all belong to an ancient ritual package, palm trees twitching in the breeze like listening ears, renewal, and cosmic struggle. But you're not watching the river now. Under this lens, your gazing similarities weren't borrowed, because inscribed in the universal human curling, coiling shape, carved humans over and over again like concentric in movement on boards. Someone has etched the outline of a giant candy land, its body looping inward, all square by square like a coiled spring. If so, you suddenly realize this is not just doodling, part of one great human archetype, always reincarnates other great gifts to ludic culture. Still, the mysterious serpent board game delights scholars. Debating whether Senet directly influenced backgammon is itself a kind of game, appears archaeologically around 3000 BCE counter and remain visible until the end of the Old Kingdom, about 2300 BCE. They throw the dice of interpretation, largely vanished from their theory land safe. Boards shaped like coral serpents carved into limestone are still playing Senet along the snake's back, representing pathways have been unearthed in tombs at Abydos and Saqqara. Imagine, the creature's head a caravan halting at a Sinai with the tail outpost, jutting at camel the bells in chorus as traders shaped like lions and marbles of varying colour sometimes accompanied the boards. Flips open a drawer unlike Senet's neat and grid, invites Mehen resembled a spire play, suggesting spiraling journeys, fractured movements into gesturing hands, perhaps the moment of luck and laughter flow perfectly. But here lies the problem, themselves no surviving rules. No translation required. Again the Egyptians left us tantalizing simple dice race mechanics, sculptures, they cross borders but no instruction manual. This is how globalization still begins, whether Mehen not just strictly a board game, but with board whether it's migrating across deserts on diagrams. The great serpent human in religious texts coiled around the sun god Ra to protect wherever games cross cultures during his night gambling tags along like a shadow. A game board twisting like a snake could thus have been tiny amounts of barley beer or trinkets. The sun's safe Egyptians by racing pawns along coils. Suddenly the line between sacred exactly and profitable gaming blurred. Move pawns along snake. Pharaohs may have disapproved marbles. Official rituals demanded ambiguity remained. But villagers likely whispered side bets anyway. Imagine a simple Mehen session in an old kingdom if two pawns can race, wagers are natural. Set little lion figures at the so in a dusty Levant tavern, two players bent over a sticks or dice, arguing forward a number of squares, but also and gradually prowls another inward along the serpent's back. Ancient Las Vegas, at the deepest minus Elvis, in Snake's head lurks. Let's circle back to the idea of backgammon's ancestry. We can speculate. The lion, even if no direct bloodline connects Senet 3000 makes way out to backgammon boards in Rome. Scholars have theorized later could also their kinship of feeling is undeniable. Their way in, then back out. When modern players slam down a circularity could symbolize the endless cycle of day and night or the eternal throwing palm sticks and groaning when pawns fell into water squares. Some Mehen boards, the motion excavated across structured squares against the clock of fate binds thousands of little lions carved from stone or ivory, forgotten their manes carefully but provided with humanity's first draft of competitive randomness. Imagine grasping that in your hand. The rest may be iteration along the serpent's back. Historians delight in pointing out literally and predator's stride, no matter how luxurious. Now place that in context. Its rules to Egyptians, lions embodied fierce protection and divine the royal strength. Game of your has more deciphered rules thanks to cuneiform instruction tablets. So the game wasn't just a casual entertainment. So ironically, it was a tiny Mesopotamian cousin is better understood structurally. If you're humming the Lion King soundtrack in your gold boards, you're not carvings, except but here the pride circle is carved in marble and guarded by scribes who scribbled actual instruction. And here lies another scholarly frustration debate. Continues to fuel some argue Mehen was cooperative rather than competitive. As the desert winds cool, you gaze instead of players Nile racing against each other. The whole group might have guided their lions mutually. Senet boards like priests with performing a ritual, protecting Mesopotamian dice clatter faintly in your ears. That flips the idea of board board play into
You can imagine
dramatization. Players trading rules.
Imagine
over
for
Egyptian
sacks,
sitting
a
shoulder
child
to
from
shoulder,
Canaan watching
murmuring
both
chants,
and creating
nudging
yet another
lions
variant.
together along the serpent.
Games
Enacting
didn't stay in
cosmic
one
solidarity.
house.
They migrated like
Others
seeds on
insist,
sandals.
no,
it was clearly
maybe
competitive.
Senet was
Who reaches
backgammon's
the head
ancestor?
first? Who captures most
Maybe
marbles?
not.
But
Because
let's be
certain,
honest,
it belongs to a
humans
first
get cranky
wave of
without
human
play
competition.
culture that made chance.
Historians
fate,
still
and
argue
movement
whether
tangible
Mayhem
across
belonged
continents.
more in temple ritual or
Egypt
across
produced
tavern
its
courts.
shining version. Mesopotamia
The truth may
produced
again be
rosettes.
both.
Greece refined states.
A fringe speculation,
Rome-hardened
the
format,
spiral
and
boards
centuries
could have
later
served
you
as
end up with a
calendars.
24-point backgammon
Each square
board
may
on a
have
cafe
marked a
table
day,
in
a
Istanbul. Moon cycle. All the
Echoes
division
line
time.
up
Square after square,
Carry
like
a lion
pawns
piece
racing
around
around
the
forward,
coil.
reciting a calendar
You brush
ritual
sand
as
from
you
your
go.
hands,
Smiling. With this model, playing
whether
was
father,
also teaching
cousin,
children
or just a
learning
parallel
lunar
branch,
months or festival
Senet
cycles
spilled into
through
a global
imitation
gaming
family. Even if
And
unproven,
every role
the
since then,
symbolic
every
resonance
tumble
of
of
dice
coils
has been
returns,
haunted by a
and
golden
repeating
board
paths
glimmering
makes
in
the
a
idea
pharaoh's
attractive.
tomb. Step back. Imagine standing in a wealthy home at Saqqara about 2500 BCE. The host rolls out a Mehen board, polished limestone carved as serpent coils. His guests nod approvingly. This isn't your cheap scratch grid. Servants bring out lion pawns, the kind smooth enough to stroke. The match begins. Throws of knucklebones determine their moves. Voices rise. Pawns climb coil after coil, nearing the serpent's head. One guest leaps ahead dramatically, the others groan, skeptical. Moments later, unlucky rolls send him sliding back, the laughter rich and stinging. If Senet was the sober practice of afterlife passage, Mehen could be the carnival, chaotic spirals mirroring chaos itself. Fun that's half playful, half dangerous. A modern joke creeps up on you. We still play spiral and snake games over 4,000 years later. Snakes and ladders, remember that? A board of ups and downs, chaotic rises and falls. Scholars often chuckle at the resemblance. Was Mehen a proto-ladderless snakes and ladders? Possibly, though conceptual links are faint. But it's charming to think, anywhere humans draw spirals or snakes, they invent rules to crawl along them. Mainstream evidence again, hundreds of Mehen boards, or fragments, survive, many associated with Old Kingdom burials. But come the Middle Kingdom, evidence begins to vanish. Something happens, a shift in focus back to Senet, the fading of Mehen. Historians can't agree why. Did its rules grow obscure until no one dared play? Was it too ritualized, becoming purely symbolic rather than entertaining? Did cultural shifts in religion push the snake concept aside? By the New Kingdom, Senet clearly dominates, linked tightly with afterlife myths. Poor Mehen coils into archaeological silence, leaving us guessing. But here's a quirky historian's tidbit: later cultures in Africa retained spiral or snake-like race games, some where marbles traveled circular tracks. Could these be faint shadows re-emerging of the old Mehen ethic? We can't prove heritage, but the echo is tantalizing. Now imagine children again. Whether or not priests solemnized Mehen, kids doubtless imitated play with scratched spirals in the sand. Two cousins crouched, flicking marbles across spirals, laughing about who'd take the head first. Egyptians may have let simple spirals entertain the young while older players withdrew to stiff Senet debates. And to an archaeologist, or you standing invisible, watching giggles swirl around the serpent coil would prove once more, fun transcends millennia. But never forget, the serpent also had teeth. Religious texts describe the cosmic serpent Apophis threatening Ra each night, and Mehen coiling protectively around. The snake could be both chaos and guardian. Playing Mehen meant moving through paradox, embracing serpent energy safely because it was turned into rule-bound play. That tension makes the game feel both playful pastime and magical diagram. Another fringe proposition is that the game simulated initiation. Each coil represented a level of understanding or trial, lions embodying raw force taming serpent danger. Reaching the center meant candidate's initiation complete. It fits with later Egyptian mystery cult approaches, though we cannot confirm links. But it suggests boards may have doubled as metaphorical textbooks of advancing through knowledge. If true, your marble race was also a spiritual exam. Fail, and remain stuck at square 17. Succeed, and join the elect near the snake's head. Picture now a scene in dim temple precinct. Priests in white linen array a stone Mehen board before a small class of initiates. They chant, move lion pieces symbolically across serpent coils, marking progress toward divine union. Each success accompanied by incense smoke and hymn fragments. A game that was simultaneously teaching, ritual, and dramatization of cosmic serpent lore. You smile at the drama. Egyptians could transform any cultural artifact into liturgy if they wanted, even a game board. Still, perhaps your favorite image is simpler: dusty courtyard, faint smell of roasting onions, two children jostling each other while tiny pawns tumble on snakeboard. The laughter is so familiar, it could be siblings on a Candyland board today. Shifts in religion may bury customs, dynasties may collapse, but human giggling doesn't date. As you rise from tracing the coils in the sand, you realize Mehen proves how diverse Egyptian ludic imagination was. Not content with grids alone, they sought spirals, animal figures, predator-prey logic. Senet dramatized life and death as linear, Mehen dramatized cycles, coils, and return. Both survived in tombs because both taught ways of imagining cosmos. Even if the serpent coils now lie silent, their echo wraps around you like Ra's guardian snake, safe, endless, and always curling further into mystery. The torchlight of palaces, the gold-trimmed Senet boxes, the spiraling coils of Mehen, they all feel grand, intimidating, carved into eternity itself. But tonight, you wander off the beaten monuments onto a smaller side street of the past, the playgrounds of children. Suddenly everything shrinks into rough clay, squeaky laughter, and dusty knees. You realize board games weren't just sacred rehearsals for kings or noble obsessions polished in ivory. They were also scrawled in dirt, molded crudely out of clay, carved on potsherds by hands that never held power. You slip inside a dusty workers' village near Thebes, where smoke curls from low roofs, neighbors exchange jokes, and children crouch outside, scratching lightning-quick grids into the sand. Here's your firm historical anchor: excavations in places like Deir el-Medina, the famous village of artisans who carved the Valley of the Kings, turned up abundant gaming fragments made of cheap materials. Limestone flakes etched with 30 squares, worn pottery sherds scratched with grids, crude clay counters shaped into lumps. Scholars conclude that children and working-class families often made knock-off boards. These may lack the prestige decor of Tutankhamun's box sets, but they testify to one thing: children in ancient Egypt played board games constantly, across classes. And they clearly weren't afraid to improvise. So now imagine the scene: a mud courtyard, dusty sandals piled in corners, a gaggle of children arguing at a hand-scratched board. One boy has used a pebble to mark squares, another has reproposed date pits for pawns. Someone tosses improvised dice carved from animal bone chips. They howl with laughter when one unlucky roll knocks a pawn backward. In the background, a tired mother grinds barley for beer, smiling at the racket, maybe tolerating it because she knows the noise keeps kids occupied while she works. This is human history at its most familiar: messy, noisy, ordinary, and absolutely central. Historically, Senet wasn't the only option for kids. Some scratched Mehen spirals outdoors. Some invented racing games with marbles. Anthropologists theorize that miniature knockoff boards introduce children not only to chance and strategy but to concepts of order, lessons crucial in a culture obsessed with math or balance. Giving your pawn a lucky leap forward mirrored the world's unpredictable Nile floods. And losing gracefully prepped you emotionally for cosmic setbacks. In other words, ancient parents saw games as teaching tools, even if wrapped in distracting fun. Quirky tidbit: archaeologists recovering children's gaming sets sometimes found board markings that appear nonsensical, grids misaligned, missing boxes. Did the children simply botch the blueprint, or were they inventing new rule variants? Imagine tiny 7-year-old scribes announcing, "My version's better, you can jump 2 squares at once." Congratulations, kids, you've created the world's first house rules. Historians still argue whether children's versions mirrored adult games faithfully or whether they freely experimented with their own mechanics. Evidence suggests both. On the one hand, we find miniaturized pawns virtually identical to adult sets, except made cheaply. On the other, odd-doodled versions, spirals, dots, alignment suggesting simplified races. Which means kids weren't passive consumers of culture, they tweaked, experimented, owned their fun. That makes children among the earliest game designers on record. Think, too, about roleplay. Children watching funerary processions or temple rituals probably imitated them in games. When a pawn dies in Senet and gets stuck, kids may have giggled, replaying all the drama they overheard in grown-up myths. And that crossover between myth and play wasn't accident. Children digested the religion of Egypt by messing around in dirt with pawns. Imagine little Khonsu shouting, "My pawn goes to Osiris now, ha ha, beaten you." That's how you learn cosmic storylines, through play. Picture another scene, 2 sisters playing at dusk, sharing a single pawn set, arguing good-naturedly. Mom sits nearby brewing a clay jar of beer, occasionally correcting them. "No, you can't skip the water square. Don't cheat," she says, half laughing. And there it is, a direct link between play and morality. The rules themselves may be fuzzy to us today, but to them, respecting the rules was a form of living math, the ethical order. Children practiced fairness in games before replicating it as adults. Here's a quirky archaeological shocker: a small child's grave in Middle Egypt turned up with a crude Senet board tucked inside. Not golden, not inscribed, just basic limestone scratches. Whoever buried the child thought gaming worth including, either to comfort their spirit in the afterlife or simply to preserve the joys of play. That snapshot across eternity tells you how parents perceived games as soul essentials, even for little ones who barely had time to live. Historians still debate whether children's cheap versions carried the same religious overlays. Was a scratch dirt board only fun, or did kids also see it as afterlife rehearsal? It's plausible most just played. But inevitably, some absorbed cosmic echoes from parents who treated losses as ominous or wins as good omens. Ancient youth culture was still threaded invisibly with adult superstitions. Let's not romanticize, some kids were sore losers. Imagine 2 boys in Deir el-Medina arguing over a role interpreted differently. One insists his pawn moves 3, the other insists 2. They push each other, pawns scatter, pebbles fly, and the board disintegrates in dust. They storm off, sulking. 5 minutes later, they return, because boredom is worse than bruised pride. Isn't that exactly what playground arguments sound like a millennium later? Fragmentary boards showing mismatched lines and erased scratches may even be the archaeological footprint of these fights. Proof forever of childhood stubbornness. An additional quirky detail: camel bones unearthed at desert outposts bear scratches resembling tally marks. Some scholars think wandering kids carved impromptu game boards right on bones. Imagine sitting next to Dad at a garrison post, carving grids into scraps, then using date stones to race. Where we doodle with crayons, they etched into bone. A quieter protest against boredom. Of course, not all play was argument. Some children must have laughed themselves to hiccups, chasing marbles off boards, carrying pawns in cheeky dances. Archaeology suggests painted pottery sometimes doubled as play surfaces, with games scratched along the rim. Toys disguised as cups. That's a clever reuse: mom drinking beer from one side, kids playing mini-Senet when she turns away. Now picture elite children. Royal princes and princesses no doubt had precious boards, jeweled pawns. But the act of play was still the same. Whether you're a girl in a fisherman's house or a young princess in a gilded nursery, you leaned over a board and squealed at lucky throws. The universal joy of a piece leaping ahead is a stronger social glue than class, wealth, or tunes. What makes this significant isn't only the games themselves but the continuity of childhood through history. Staring at fragments of crooked lines in pottery shards, you can practically hear kids shrieking or sulking. Board games gave Egyptian children a childhood in a recognizably modern sense, not just endless chores, but time to laugh, dream, and argue about imaginary rules. In a way, Senet and Mehen gave them not just an afterlife passport, but a childhood passport. And you recognize another lesson. Teaching strategy, patience, rule-keeping through games was not wasted training. Some of these kids grew up into artisans, architects, generals. The resilience learned from surviving 3 bad rolls in a row may well have helped them endure Nile famines, harsh overseers, or foreign attack. Childhood play builds adult survival. Egyptians may not have phrased it in psychological jargon, but they lived it out. So you lean back, watching a gaggle of children still sitting in dust, pieces scattering everywhere. Their laughter rises as late sun hits mud walls. A father returns sweaty from labor, smiles at the game, and joins. Family, childhood, merriment, all there in miniature. The cosmically serious Egyptians, those pyramid makers, those tomb worshippers, also carried a playful streak painted in clay. And that's the power of Section 9's exploration. These games stitched not only pharaohs and priests into eternity, but children too. And those children carried improvisation, bickering, joy, and invention into every corner of their world. Their scratchy sandboards may have crumbled overnight in the wind, but for that one evening, they were eternal. Much like us, playing, laughing, and carrying fragments of eternity without realizing it. The cheerful racket of children fades as you walk away from Deir el-Medina's courtyards. The air turns quieter, heavier. Sand muffles your feet, but up ahead looms the unmistakable silhouette of pylons, towering obelisks, and long colonnades that seem to stretch like stone arms into the dark. You've wandered into the shadow of a temple, the house of gods, a place where incense smoke thickens the evening and where a sacred hush prevails even in the midnight hour. You pause, half expecting priests in spotless linen to glare at you for intruding. Yet what stirs your curiosity most is not the ceremonies of chant and hymn but a whispered question that historians have debated for decades. Would board games ever have been tolerated in these sacred precincts? Tonight, you press your ear against the temple gates and try to piece together the puzzle of games in the temple's shadow. First, The baseline: temples in ancient Egypt were not simply prayer halls, they were economic, political, and educational centers. Priests administered granaries, stored papyrus, taught scribes. Temples dominated not only religion but daily life. And for all their solemnity, human beings ran them. Which means the likelihood of playful fingers sketching game boards in quiet temple corners is tantalizingly high. In fact, archaeologists at Karnak and Luxor discovered carved graffiti depressions on massive stone blocks that suspiciously resemble gaming grids. Were they casually scratched by bored guards between rituals? Or covertly by apprentices in training? The evidence whispers yes. Egyptians left us literal doodles in the margins of eternity. Mainstream fact anchor: at temple complexes like Karnak at Thebes, archaeologists recorded faint linear patterns on the bases of massive stone monuments resembling Senet or hounds and jackals game layouts. Though interpretations vary, many scholars argue that stonecutters, guards, or even temple staff etched reusable grids during long vigils. This suggests ordinary workers inside sacred precincts entertained themselves quietly during downtime. So yes, despite official temple gravitas, play seeped in. The sacred and the playful cohabited the same spaces, like laughter echoing under vaulted ceilings. Picture it: two sleepy guards leaning on their spears at dusk, drawing lines in the dust along the temple floor. The incense is burning, chants hum from the sanctuary, but at the gates, the guards roll knucklebones, slide pawns, and joke about each other's luck. They probably imagined the gods weren't offended, maybe they even imagined the gods peeked over their shoulders. After all, chance was a divine tool. Playing while on temple watch could feel like conversing with fate. Now here's a quirky tidbit. In the precinct of Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramses III, archaeologists identified faint board markings etched right onto the sandstone steps of outer gateways. Think about that: gigantic gates adorned with battle scenes of pharaohs smiting enemies, and on the quiet step below, bored guards doodled Senet. Imagine a guard waiting for relief, flipping a pawn along squares carved right under a hieroglyphic of eternal victory. It's the playful graffiti of antiquity, cosmic propaganda up top, bored humanity down below. Historians still argue whether priests themselves engaged openly in games within temple inner courts. Some say absolutely not. Priests considered play akin to frivolity, potentially polluting sacred timing. Others suggest that priests, like everyone else, found joy in play, perhaps using games to meditate on fate. Senet already embodied theological metaphors, so playing could be a devotional extension rather than distraction. The absence of definitive rulings keeps debates alive. Were priests playing quietly after rituals, or did they scold novices for fooling around? Nobody can confirm. Now lean in a little closer. Imagine a young temple acolyte, head still shorn, sweeping sand from the outer courtyard. When the high priest vanishes inside to chant liturgies, the boy pulls out a scratch board hidden on a limestone slab. He lays down a few pebbles, tosses bone sticks nervously, grins as he nudges along a pawn. Another acolyte joins him, suppressing giggles. They whisper fast, hoping not to be caught. A shadow looms, the stern priest appears again, scowling. The acolytes freeze. The priest sighs, shakes his head, but maybe, secretly, he remembers his own childhood boards. He pretends to scold, then leaves them be. That's how you suspect it went, human tolerance tempered by unspoken understanding. Another mainstream anchor, temples often doubled as schools, especially for scribes. In these House of Life precincts, apprentices spent long days memorizing lists, copying texts, reciting hymns. Archaeologists excavated ostraca, pottery shards, near temple schools inscribed with combinations of gaming grids alongside vocabulary practice. This suggests that young students doodled their games during lessons, the same way school children today sneak tic-tac-toe into margins of math notebooks. Humans always carve distraction into study. Quirky aside here, one ostracon discovered near a temple school showed half a Senet board scratched unevenly, with hieroglyphs in clumsy handwriting beside it. Was it a child bored with copywork? Or a student deliberately blending lesson and play, writing columns of words as pawns past squares? Whatever the case, the artifact makes you smile. It's undeniably the doodle of a mischievous scribe in training. Historians still argue whether temples formerly used games for teaching metaphysics. Some imaginative scholars think priests used Senet grids to illustrate concepts like rebirth and fate in lessons. Others counter, insisting adults distinguish teaching diagrams from casual diversion. Lacking explicit texts, the debate remains. Yet the possibility entices, a geometry lesson doubling as a quick race across squares. Another fringe suggestion, some stone gaming boards carved on temple floors may have functioned ritually like cosmic diagrams, not actual play objects. The snake coil Mehen pattern carved near temple entrances may have symbolized roused nightly passage more than children racing lions. But then again, no archaeologist has resisted flicking imaginary pawns across those coils when standing in person. Sacred diagram or playground? Often, both. Let's conjure a vivid image again. It's noon, blazing sun boiling over Karnak's pylons. Inside, choirs chant verse to Amun, censers sway, the sanctum drips shadow. But outside, in the shadowed outer court, a handful of guards, scribes, and temple workers squat with boards etched right into the very paving stones. Their laughter is muffled but audible. A pawn clacks to final square, one player shouts triumphantly, the others groan. The chants keep droning in inner halls, unaffected. It's not sacrilege, it's just Egypt's eternal blending, joy folded inside reverence, play curling under solemnity, games breathing at the temple's threshold. Here's another quirky nugget. Later Greek travelers marveled that Egyptians seemed to play while worshipping, remarking on the mixture of sacred festival and games. Herodotus himself noted in his histories that Egyptians were great festival celebrants, mixing song, dance, and amusements with ritual voyages carrying god statues. Perhaps he glimpsed festival crowds also tossing dice, turning temple processions into carnivals. If temple festivals resembled modern fairs, then board games absolutely roared alongside. But again, historians wrestle. Was this mere casual carnival attached to temples or true theological integration of games into ritual? Without firm texts, the board remains blank. Still, glyphs of pharaohs gaming in company of gods make clear Egyptians saw no hard boundary. The house of Amun might thunder solemnly in one chamber, while in the next, sticks rolled with equal weight. You walk quietly from column to column, feeling the cool sandstone under your hand. As you pass through one colonnade, your eye catches faint notches scratched on a step. You kneel. 30 boxes, lined faintly in an almost invisible pattern. It's unmistakable, a Senet board carved into the very skeleton of Karnak temple. You trace it gently, and you can almost hear voices of ancient novices laughing under their breath, sharing a stolen game while the smell of myrrh clung to their clothes. sacred stone and profane giggles. That's Egypt in a nutshell. As night deepens, an owl hoots from the roof beams, and you step away from the giant pylons. The temple facade towers above, immovable, eternal. But somewhere down on those steps, a bored worker once scratched his own mark, rolled a tiny pawn, and smiled to himself before rising for duty again. That scratch survived storms, dynasties, invasions. And when you look closely, you realize it whispers across 3 millennia. Even in the holiest houses, people made time for play. You edge away from the looming pylons of Karnak, the faint scent of incense still clinging to your clothes, and your thoughts drift outward beyond Egypt's frontiers. The night desert horizon hums like an open port. You picture donkeys loaded with trade goods, Phoenician sails gliding over foam, and caravans stretching endlessly towards Syria, Nubia, and the Sinai. Egypt was never sealed off. Its greatness was partly built on exchange. And with exchange came not just metals, timbers, or spices, but ideas, cultural cargo as fragile and powerful as lapis beads. Among them, perhaps, were games. Because if Egyptians adored pawns sliding across boards, so did Sumerians, Canaanites, and later Persians. Tonight, you follow one tantalizing trail. Did games travel across borders? Were foreign puzzles imported, and did Egypt, in turn, export its love of grid and charms? The firm historical anchor first. Archaeologists have unearthed gaming artifacts of Mesopotamian design, like the game of 20 squares, within Egyptian contexts, especially in the New Kingdom. Some Egyptian boards, as you already saw with Tutankhamun's treasures, feature dual faces, one side a Senet grid, the other nearly identical to Mesopotamia's 20-square layout. That alone screams cultural contact. Egyptian elites were clearly aware of, and possibly fascinated by, foreign amusements. This is hard evidence that game culture moved along trade routes. So picture it, a Phoenician trader docking at Memphis, bringing cedar logs from Lebanon and a curious board with rosette patterns. Egyptian nobles eye it curiously, intrigued by its mechanics. Before long someone commissions a luxury Egyptian knockoff, carved in ivory to match local tastes. Play travels as easily as perfume. But what about the opposite direction? Did Egypt itself export Senet to its neighbors? Many suggest yes. Carved boards resembling 30-square Senet layouts have been recovered as far afield as Levantine sites, though sometimes with regional twists. Imagine a Canaanite family scratching their own Egyptian-style board into plaster, boasting to guests, "It's the pharaoh's game." Games serve as cultural prestige items. Owning Egyptian brands might have been like sporting Paris fashion, proof of cosmopolitan flair. Yet historians still argue whether certain finds abroad are true Egyptian exports or just convergent inventions that coincidentally resembled Senet. Diffusion versus independence remains an unsolved puzzle. Evidence is suggestive but not decisive, and debates have lasted decades. Here's a quirky tidbit. One supposed Egyptian-derived game, nicknamed Hounds and Jackals by modern archaeologists, has been found in both Egypt and Mesopotamian contexts. The board contains rows of peg holes, and players apparently raced pegs carved into the shapes of animal heads across tracks toward a goal. Some boards were exported widely. Examples appeared as far away as Anatolia. The hybrid nature of this game suggests lively borrowing. Egypt may have innovated some designs, then shipped them abroad where tweaks accumulated. In short, ancient cross-platform compatibility. Think of bored Egyptian officials on diplomatic missions. They arrive in byblos for trade negotiation, evenings stretching long after banquets. They pull out a board, call over their hosts, mimic roles, and within half an hour both sides are jabbering through laughter despite language barriers. The universal grammar of fun takes over. They didn't share words, but chants and pawns spoke fluently. So consider again Egypt's contacts with the Hyksos, those mysterious Levantine rulers who controlled the Nile Delta during the Second Intermediate Period, circa 1650 to 1550 BCE. The Hyksos introduced horses, chariots, and arguably new tactical weapons into Egypt. Did they also carry games? Many historians think so. Excavations at Avaris, the Hyksos' capital, revealed boards like hounds and jackals, hinting at cultural exchange. Thus, games may have been one more entry in Egypt's long ledger of Hyksos' innovations, usually cast negatively by hostile later scribes, but in truth vital to cultural mingling. Now edge down to Nubia. Excavations show Nubian burials occasionally contained gaming boards strongly resembling Egyptian Senet. Here the influence seems clearer. Egyptian governors stationed in Nubia, as well as soldiers in frontier forts, brought their habits with them. Picture soldiers stationed far south, hip-deep in boredom, carving their Senet squares onto clay floors. Local populations picked it up. A board game made more lasting cultural impact than military garrisons themselves. Fun travels more gently than spears. Let's anchor another example. In Megiddo, modern Israel, archaeologists uncovered imported Egyptian gaming pieces, bone pegs, boards unmistakably Egyptian in style. These finds match the wider evidence of Egyptian contact in Canaan, not just war campaigns but cultural diffusion. Board games moved alongside scarabs and amulets. That's how Egypt imprinted daily life abroad, not only through temple architecture or personal adornments, but quiet evening competitions on borrowed squares. Quirky touch, some archaeologists swear certain Egyptian pawns found abroad, spool-shaped, neatly carved, show little wear. Were they status trinkets, displayed but rarely played? Maybe foreign elites simply flaunted them as Egyptian exotica. Imagine showing guests, this pawn comes straight from Memphis. Whether played or not, they functioned as prestige tokens dripping with cultural capital. Historians still argue whether migrations of game culture were top-down, kings and nobles trading fashion toys, or bottom-up, soldiers, workers, merchants spreading fun informally. Likely both. Imagine the Hyksos elite proudly setting fancy imported boards in palaces, while Egyptian mercenaries in Canaan scratched beginner grids into dirt. That dual diffusion mirrors how Coke bottles sprawl everywhere in our world, elite advertising plus street adoption. Now, let's make it tactile. You slip into the bustle of a port at Byblos around 1500 BCE. Sailors unload cedar logs, tin ingots, amphorae of oil. Amid the clatter, you catch a small circle of sailors from Egypt and locals crouched around a rough board scratched into the wood of a crate lid. Pawns clatter, shouts rise, hands gesticulate. Nobody needs translators here. The game explains itself through gesture. Out of the haze of smoke and brine, you hear laughter that sounds identical to Nile courtyards or Mesopotamian alleys. Universal grammar again: roll, move, win, gloat. Here's a quirky overlap. Visual motifs of foreign games sometimes crept onto Egyptian boards. The rosette used in Mesopotamian royal game of yore appears on double-sided Egyptian sets. Was it purely decorative, or acknowledgement of foreign prestige? Hard to conclusively say. Historians muse, perhaps Egyptian craftsmen inserted a borrowed symbol to lend cachet. This board doubles as an international style. Early globalization, carved in ivory. Fringe speculation, did Egypt adopt foreign rules but overlay them with its theological concepts? Imagine priests borrowing the 20 squares format but reinterpreting its hazards as symbols of chaos deities, just as Senet's water square symbolized peril. That would essentially Egyptianize imports. It's plausible. Cultures rarely consume imports raw, they repurpose them for local myth. That's how beer recipes, spells, and board games all metamorphosed when crossing Nile borders. Even military campaigns probably carried game culture. Egyptian soldiers besieging Canaanite fortresses no doubt carried boards scrawled on wood, filling long idle hours. Local recruits probably observed, then imitated. This is soldierly boredom turned into cultural diffusion. And conversely, Canaanite captives brought to Egypt might integrate their gaming styles into households, giving hybrid offspring like hounds and jackals. War and fun, bitter and sweet, often arrive in the same package. You step back now into starlit silence, mulling it over. Egypt's board games were not hermit inventions. They pulsed outward across Bronze Age routes into a Mediterranean lattice of play. And foreign amusement streamed inward, sparking hybrid designs. The games themselves whisper a larger truth: civilizations are never isolated, even when building mountains of stone. Ideas, laughter, and porn slip quietly across borders on camel packs faster than troops in chariots. So when you hear the raucous cheer of pawns hitting lucky throws in a Levantine port, or the solemn scuff of a lion pawn spiraling on a serpent coil in Abydos, you're hearing the same universal echo. Egypt imported puzzles, exported fun, hybridized games as readily as they hybridized architecture and belief. Board games are proof that even at history's grandest scale, cultural exchange could be playful, intimate, and human. You leave behind the rattling ports and desert caravans of Section 11, stepping instead into the heart of an Egyptian village festival. Tonight the Nile's banks are glowing with torchlight, drums are thumping with a slow hypnotic beat, and women laugh as they toss flower garlands into the cool night air. Huge jars of frothy beer are being ladled into cups, lamb roasts fill the wind with tangy spice, and clusters of villagers gather in noisy circles. Amid the storytelling, flirting, and dancing, you spot something woven seamlessly into the joyful chaos: board games. This isn't the quiet whisper of children at play or priests sneaking moves on temple steps. This is raucous, tipsy, communal gaming, women clapping, men shouting over pawns, neighbors jostling shoulders. The board game here belongs not only to gods and kings, but to everyone, and it thrives best under torchlight with beer flowing. Mainstream grounding first. Egyptologists unearthed boatloads of evidence showing that beer was central to festivals and daily leisure. Workers at Deir el-Medina received part of their wages in bread and beer. Scribes recorded deliveries of beer rations during feasts. Archaeological remains confirm that games, boards etched into stone walls or portable wooden sets, often appear in contexts associated with communal drink and merriment. Together, this paints a vivid picture: gaming and beer went hand in hand in Egyptian leisure. And women joined right in, which is striking for ancient times when public leisure often centered on men. So, picture it in vivid color. Groups of women, their eyes gleaming mischievously in lamplight, sit cross-legged around a limestone slab scratched with a 30-square grid. Their jewelry clinks with each hand gesture as they slam pawns into squares with gleeful abandon. The air smells of roasted duck and honey cakes. A man plays a reed flute in the corner, trying to keep attention, but the shrieks of victory drown him out when one woman's pawn surges ahead to the final square. She raises her beer jar in victory. They cheer. Competitive joy is universal. Now for your quirky tidbit. In tomb scenes like those of Nebaman, circa 1350 BCE, banquets are depicted where women attend lavish drinking parties, dancing, clapping, and sometimes, though less explicitly, playing games. Scholars note faint painted boards in background clusters suggesting game sets among banquet gear. It hints that fashionable women weren't merely passive guests at feasts, they laughed in circles, gambled small trinkets, and occasionally beat smug noblemen at their own afterlife rehearsals. Imagine a nobleman sulking because Lady so-and-so just trounced him in Senet despite his ritual prayers. The goddess Atha, patron of wine and fun, must have smiled wide that night. Historians still argue whether female participation in games was an everyday household reality or more festival-specific. Some Egyptologists point to domestic boards in women's quarters as evidence it was common. Others say boards found there were ceremonial grave goods, not toys of daily play. But honestly, the sight of women's jewelry arranged beside game pawns in burials suggests strong personal attachment. After all, if you pack it in your coffin, you probably loved using it when alive. Now press yourself deeper into this festival crowd. The music grows bawdier, men and women are dancing barefoot in circles. An old woman leans heavily on a board while her opponent sips from a clay jar and grins smugly. A child giggles while fetching more pawns. And yes, like gambling is happening. A necklace pendant lies beside the board, staked as a prize. Beer makes people bold. Egyptians probably risked small valuables on games the same way modern cousins do on dice or cards. Not enough to ruin lives, just enough to add a thrill. That shimmer of risk always intensifies the laughter. Quirky aside, records from workmen's villages show fines for the disturbances caused by drunken brawls. Do you really think idle drinking alone caused those fights? Not likely. Picture the scene: two neighbors, both drunk, locked in a fierce match, accusing each other of cheating on square counts. A pawn is thrown across the courtyard. Shoves begin. Law scribes record reaction. Thousands of years later, archaeologists read the note and smiled, proof that beer and board games combined could brew both joy and fistfights. Some things never change. Here's the delightful balance: the act of gaming among women wasn't considered frivolous or shameful. Egyptian art and texts frequently depict women in the thick of social life. Atha herself governed love, wine, festivity, and music. Female presence at gaming boards therefore symbolized participation in cosmic joy. In other words, Egyptian women weren't confined to household alone, they joined men in games, festivals, and ceremony. This marks Egypt as relatively progressive compared to other Bronze Age lands where female public play barely featured. Let's add another anchor. Excavations at Thebes unearthed faience gaming pieces stored among cosmetics containers in women's burials. Imagine amulets and senet pawns intermingled in a cosmetic box. It shaped a picture: a woman treasured her coal, her mirrors, and her pawns equally. Possibly, she carried them at festival night, playing until dawn under moon and drum. If eternity required a suitcase, she packed glamour and games together. Historians still debate the scale of female participation in gaming. Was it mostly elite women flitting in noble courts, or did village wives huddle over clay knockoffs too? Hard to prove, because poorer sets decayed quickly. But given the abundance of scratchboards everywhere, it's more plausible ordinary women joined daily as well. Games were too widespread to exclude half the population. Beer brewing, primarily women's work, was itself bound to festivals. So, where there's beer, there's game. Logical chain closed. Now imagine comedic banter in broad daylight during festival. A man slurs, "The goddess favors me," as he rolls. His wife rolls better, slaps her pawn onto the house of rebirth, and dances off laughing, "The goddess favors me instead." The crowd roars, beer slops, and the priest outside turns a blind eye. Because festivals belong to laughter as much as prayer. A fringe theory goes further, that women playing during festivals sometimes ritualized their games as invocations for fertility or love. Pawns moving forward signifying new life cycles, victories promising household prosperity. Did couples see their festival matches as luck omens? Probably plausible, though evidence is interpretive. But this idea links social fun directly to domestic hope. If you're a couple praying for a child, a drunken Senet win by the wife could be cheered as a prophecy. A joyful ritual wrapped inside laughter. Notice too the textural detail. Pieces weren't always ebony or ivory at festivals, sometimes they were dried fruit pits. Imagine the hilarious calamity when one pawn gets eaten by accident during the final stretch of a heated game. Scrambling to grab another date pit pawn, comedy born on the spot. Quirky fact worth savoring, many illustrations of Senet boards depict two women facing off, a rarity in ancient visual culture, which so often prioritized male elites. But it means something, female gaming wasn't niche. It was iconic enough to paint on walls. Scholars suspect noble women may have had as fierce a reputation for gaming skill as men. Somewhere in eternity, a noble husband is still sulking that his wife consistently outplayed him at Senet. Festival nights add one more layer to Egypt's blend of sacred and profane. Chanting priests carried statues in processions, while audiences in outer courts feasted, swayed to music, and yes, tossed dice. Egyptians folded fun right into religion. No separation. To them, delight itself was a divine offering. Step back one last time and look across this Nile festival. Torches flicker, jars clatter, pawns jump squares, women cheer, men groan, children giggle. A donkey brays from the shadows at the absurdity of it all. Against temple pylons towering behind, you see one culture's genius again, eternity rehearsed in play, gender inclusion woven directly into fun, chaos accepted with laughter and beer. And as you drift onward, you realize why archaeologists keep finding game pawns nestled among jewelry, why banquets painted in tombs show guests at both cups and boards. Egyptians celebrated with both. Eternity demanded rules, but joy demanded breaking them once in a while too. And if you lost at Senet under flickering torchlight, no angst, the goddess of the promised there was always another round tomorrow night. You slip out of the clamor of festival drums, leaving behind beer-stained pawns and women's gleeful boasting. The night quiets again, and smoke from torches trails upward like tired sighs. This time, you kneel beside a solitary game board carved into stone, its squares still faint under your fingertips. Around it lie tiny amulets, scarabs, ankhs, fragments of faience in azure blue. You suddenly realize, in Egypt, board games weren't only about mechanics or even laughter. They stitched together two powerful dimensions of the Egyptian worldview, luck and strategy, chance, and skill, all bound up with the idea of magical protection. Pawns didn't move alone. Players equipped themselves with charms, prayers, and amulets, believing these little objects shifted the odds. Tonight, you sit by the board and examine how Egyptians blurred superstition with tactical cleverness to make play richer, more dangerous, and maybe even more divine. First, the anchor. Archaeologists have found gaming pieces and boards inscribed with protective hieroglyphs. Some squares in Senet are explicitly titled, the House of Rebirth, the House of Water, the House of Three Truths. Their language is magical, not mechanical. Owners believed the outcome of a game reflected divine will. Burying a board alongside amulets reinforced that connection. Win on the board, win in eternity. Lose, and your soul risked chaos. You lean forward, watching two men play in a workshop after hours. One clutches an amulet of Biz, the dwarf god who wards off evil. He fingers it every time he throws casting sticks, muttering a prayer under his breath. The other has no charm, only sharp wits, and he smirks smugly whenever he pulls ahead. Charm versus cunning. Already you see polar philosophies, some trusted in magic objects, others in strategy. Here's a quirky tidbit: some players apparently treated pawns themselves as protective amulets. Scarab-shaped playing pieces have been excavated, as well as ones inscribed with divine symbols. Think about that. Your pawn was not just a neutral token, but a magical soldier, carrying its own protective mojo. Imagine slamming down a piece carved like Horus and shouting, "Beat that!" The intimidation alone could rattle an opponent. The line between gaming gear and life amulets blurred entirely. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians genuinely believed charms could change a role's outcome or whether charms simply offered psychological comfort. At stake is a broader anthropological debate. Did ancient people see randomness as negotiable with divine bribes, or did they grasp that luck mocked them regardless of trinkets? Evidence suggests both. Some clutched amulets in hope. Others mocked their rivals for believing. In festival shrines, one group laughed at amulet dependency, while another swore the gods rigged roles if not petitioned. Now look at the strategy side. Senet boards suggest tangible decision-making beyond pure dice. With multiple pawns, players had to choose, advance the lead pawn, delay to block rivals, or protect others in safe zones. Strategy mixed with randomness. Egyptians learned psychology here too, bluffing, feigning confidence, intimidating opponents. If you've ever tried a poker face, you've reenacted Pharaoh's smirk hiding a useless role. Tactics mattered, or at least players convinced themselves they did, even when sticks betrayed them. A fun quirky detail, graffiti in village courtyards sometimes shows exclamation scribbles near etched squares, as if marking house rules like "stop here" or "lucky space." It hints at players adding extra layers of tactics. Modern Monopoly house rules had nothing on these house-modified Senet sets. Outsmarting rivals wasn't always about luck. Sometimes it meant engineering the rule system to your advantage. Now imagine tension across classes. A nobleman with a gold amulet sits opposite a scribe who prides himself on pure skill. Every time the noble throws poorly, he growls about losing despite his trinket. The scribe shrugs, smirks, inches ahead. Spectators laugh. Is wealth powerless against cunning? Social narratives may have arisen at those boards, games as miniature class critique. the charm-laden pharaoh could still be outsmarted by a clever under-official. For one fleeting moment, randomness leveled hierarchies. But don't forget how amulets turned lost rolls into omens. Imagine rolling badly 3 times in a row. A crowd whispers, "The gods disfavor you." A rival smirks, "Osiris has chosen his victor." Suddenly the game tips into fortune-telling. Play transfigures into prophecy. And for Egyptians, that was natural. Games tested not just skill but whether fate itself approved of you. Winning signaled cosmic favor, losing humiliated beyond the board. Fringe theorists even argue some pragmatic gamblers may have invented cheap dice shaped to bias rolls, hiding behind claims of divine magic. Evidence for weighted sticks is speculative but not impossible. If true, then ancient Egypt invented not only gaming but cheating at gaming. Congratulations, humanity, we've always been sorely predictable. Board games also became stages of moral rehearsal. Parents scolded kids for sneaking pawns. Friends teased each other for dishonest counting. Through play, ethics were performed and internalized. Egyptians obsessed over mat, cosmic order. That ideal filtered into leisure. When you obeyed Senet's rules, you mirrored divine order. When you cheated, you imitated chaos itself. A pawn out of place was like social disorder. Pharaoh's scribes might have winked at this ironic symbolism while still defending their squares. Here's the sensory image. A dusty courtyard late afternoon, linen tunics sticking to sweat, women weaving baskets in the corner. At the center, a game intensifies. Sticks clatter. Pawn slide. One player's protective amulet glints as he mutters a blessing. The other folds arms confidently, trusting only his strategic placement. The roll decides, it's disastrous for the amulet owner. The cool-headed strategist grins, wings, and others clap. The gods, at least tonight, favored brains over charms. Historians still argue over the psychological role of gaming in resilience. Was it about practicing rational strategy under stress, or surrendering to randomness with grace? Likely both. Board games let Egyptians rehearse life's paradox. Sometimes the gods reward cunning, sometimes they blast it aside with sheer luck. The game taught acceptance. Perhaps the charm was not to guarantee victory, but to remind players that even losing contained divine lesson. A fringe speculation adds spice. Some charms coupled with gaming may have doubled as love devices. Papyrus spells found in magical texts often link amulets with affection. Could tossing charms on game boards have also symbolized wooing? 2 lovers playing Senet under torchlight, one sliding pieces while dropping a love amulet, murmuring, "If I win, our love is destined." You smile at the universality. Gaming as flirtation, undeniably plausible. Already beer and Senet together sound suspiciously like the first date nights in history. The Egyptian mind loved duality. Which means their gaming world was always dual too, amulets battling strategy, skill offset by luck, order flirting with chaos. Their boards were tension fields where no single explanation sufficed. A pawn wasn't innocent, it glowed with magical power. A dice throw wasn't arbitrary, it was the gods' official verdict. And yet, cunning humans still schemed, bluffed, smiled, and cheated. Playing a board game in Egypt meant inhabiting their philosophy, existence as both fate-driven and will-driven. You rise from your crouch, brushing clear the little faience amulets scattered by the stone board. The dawn light washes in faintly, shimmering on the pawn squares. You feel the whisper lingering. In ancient Egypt, games weren't just games. They were miniature dramas of life, skill countered by magic, order shadowed by chaos, laughter tied to destiny. Every pawn bore both hope and humor. Every toss of sticks was both tactic and prayer. And as you walk away, you realize how oddly comforting that is today. When you play a game and mutter lucky dice, don't fail me, you're not just being silly, you're being an ancient Egyptian. Thousands of years ago, someone with a scarab amulet whispered the same plea, rolled, lost, laughed, and played again. The sky lightens faintly at the horizon as you walk on, leaving behind the laughter of dice, amulets, and flirtatious gaming sessions. Suddenly the mood shifts as your imagination creeps several thousand years forward, from Egypt's living villages to dust-choked valleys of the 19th century. The desert is no longer a festival ground, it has become a European excavation site. Picture gentlemen in waistcoats, their collars melting in Egyptian heat, lugging picks, brushes, and notebooks. Around them, long trenches slice through desert sand, and buried treasures, statues, coffins, papyri, and yes, gaming boards, are unearthed, boxed, and shipped to Europe's museums. Tonight, your journey takes a strange turn. You're watching 19th century archaeologists as they become the world's most excited board game collectors. Here's the fact anchor: when the great wave of Egyptology began after Napoleon's expedition at the turn of the 19th century, Western scholars, collectors, and adventurers flooded into Egypt. They weren't looking for board games specifically. They wanted mummies, statues, obelisks. Yet in tombs and houses, those curious carved boxes with grids, those sets of spools and cones, kept showing up. They were swept into crates and carried off into the Louvre, the British Museum, Berlin, Turin. By the mid-1800s, Senet and Hounds and Jackals boards were cropping up behind glass, puzzling curators and delighting the public. Imagine the scene: Victorian London, dim museum halls glowing in gaslight, and ladies pressing gloved fingers against glass to marvel at Tutankhamun's golden game box, still misunderstood but tantalizing. A curious contraption from the tombs, newspapers reported, some claiming it was Egyptian chess, others insisting it was a dice lottery. Archaeological imagination caught fire, even if rules remained elusive. Quirky tidbit: Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie, the pioneering British archaeologist in the late 19th century, took more interest in boards than most. While digging at Cahoon and other sites, he catalogued fragments of Senet boards with precision, sketching their squares and measuring pawns. Petrie speculated boldly about their rules. His sketches became some of the earliest systematic attempts to treat Egyptian board games as more than curiosities. Yet even he couldn't resist sometimes dramatizing them as ritual struggles for the soul. Historians still argue whether Petrie's reconstructions leaned too heavy on imagination. Now imagine Petrie, bent over his desk, fiddling with a limestone flake bearing a scratched grid. He places pebbles onto squares, muttering about the travails of Osiris. One colleague rolls his eyes: this is child's play. Petrie snaps back: exactly, child's play that lasted 3,000 years. His enthusiasm was infectious enough to leave marks we still follow today. Here's the quirky irony: European scholars loved projecting their own cultural frames onto Senet. In France, some insisted it was ancestral chess. In Germany, a few said it resembled dice gambling. In Britain, with its mania for classical comparisons, Victorians confidently called Senet the pastime of pharaohs, a game of kings. They didn't entirely miss the truth, but they bent the lens heavily through their own obsessions. Visitors in Victorian fairs bought cheap replicas, decorated with pseudo-hieroglyphs. Cairo bazaars began selling tourist versions, awkward wooden grids with combs, marketed as original Egyptian chess. Suddenly, souvenir stalls echoed with pawns clattering. Egypt's most spiritual game had already been commodified by the age of railroads. Historians still argue about the ethics of those excavators. Boards disappeared into private collections, some sets were misdated, mixed with Mesopotamian finds, or poorly documented. Was knowledge gained at the cost of cultural stripping? Modern Egyptian archaeologists sigh over crates of their heritage now sitting in European basements. The debate remains. Rich Westerners gave Senet global fame, but also deprived it of context. Now lean in on the sensory detail. A dusty trench at Thebes, 1880s. Archaeologists stumble onto a noble burial shaft. Among jewelry and jars lies a wooden box inlaid with ivory, 30 painted squares gleaming faintly even after millennia. The excavators gasp. One whispers, "A treasure fit for a king." Within hours it's in a crate bound for Alexandria, then a steamship. Back in Europe, scholars gawk at it under bright lamps, speculate wildly, and scribble in journals. The board is no longer a private heirloom, it's a global curiosity, raising more questions than answers. At almost the same time, American museums began competing. Financiers sponsored digs with the explicit goal of grabbing artifacts. Gaming boards, exotic yet less grand than statues, sometimes became overlooked prizes, sold at auction, jumbled with beads. An odd paradox. What Egyptians saw as funeral essentials, Victorians saw as parlor novelties. Quirky anecdote. In 1896, a Senet box ended up in the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. Scholars fiddled with it and argued late into the night about how pieces should move. Some published rule reconstructions, others denounced them. It became a Victorian parlor game, reading about pharaohs' pastime while sipping brandy. And yes, some scholars literally used the boards at dinner parties to woo guests, half joking about summoning Osiris over cigars. Academia can get playful when artifacts look like board games. Fringe speculation from that era was wild. Some Victorian mystics declared Senet boards were secret alchemical diagrams. Others insisted they were Atlantean relics that drifted to Egypt. Spiritualist salons in London reportedly dragged out boards to the Channel pharaohs during a séance monopoly round. No real Egyptologist took those claims seriously. But it shows how enchanting a mysterious object with no rules can be. Mainstream point again. By early 20th century, scholars like T.E. Peat and later Timothy Kendall attempted reconstructing genuine rule sets based on the placement of hieroglyphs in tomb paintings. They cross-compared multiple boards, hypothesized about the meaning of safe houses, trap squares. Modern Egyptology still wrestles with these. The archaeological record remains fragmentary, but Victorian passion basically relaunched Senet as a living conversation. Now hold that image, museum glass cases catching lamplight, visitors pressing their noses against wooden ivory squares, children whispering, "Is this pharaoh's chess?" Those early displays, flawed and colonial as they were, gave board games longevity across public imagination. Without Petrie's dusty sketches and Victorian gawking, would Senet have crossed into global pop culture? Probably not. History is messy, Egyptians invented it, but Victorian archaeologists exported it into memory. As you stroll away, the image lingers, excavation sites ringing with scrapes of shovels, gentlemen scholars kneeling excitedly over tiny pawns, and curators proudly labeling them as Egyptian puzzles. The game once buried for immortal souls now reborn as academic fad. It's messy, problematic, fascinating, and eternal, exactly as the Egyptians would have wanted. You step through the dust-laden 19th century museum halls of Section 14, watching curators polish Senet boards under weak gaslight, when suddenly the scene around you flickers. You're no longer in Oxford or Paris but in a dimly lit movie theater from the 20th century. A projector whirs overhead, popcorn scent fills the air, and on the silver screen a rugged adventurer dashes into a pharaoh's tomb. He dodges booby traps, grabs treasure, and there in the corner, of course, is a glittering game board, oversized and menacing, like Egyptian chess played by gods themselves. The audience gasps. You can't help but smile. Hollywood has arrived, and with it comes a gleeful distortion of history. Tonight you're not in a tomb. You're in cinema seats, comparing real fantasy with archaeological truth. Mainstream fact anchor first. Senet boards appear in multiple modern films, TV documentaries, and even video games. Often portrayed simply as the chess of the pharaohs, they pop up in stories from the Ten Commandments to niche mummy thrillers. Yet in nearly every case, Hollywood warps them into exotic props of mystery, sometimes weaponizing them as puzzle boxes, other times as traps leading to doom. Rarely does cinema let the board remain what it was, part leisure, part spiritual rehearsal. But exaggeration sells. Giant jeweled pawns sparkle brighter than history ever intended. Imagine, in some silver screen scene, an explorer presses a pawn, and a secret tomb door slides open. Or worse, place the wrong piece, and the ceiling crashes down. Real Senet? A race game of chance and strategy. Hollywood Senet? Literally a trigger mechanism for cinematic thrills. Here's a quirky tidbit. In several mid-20th century films, Egyptian chess sets are actually bastardized versions of Senet boards, redesigned with extra graphics to appear more complicated. Set decorators often glued random scarabs and cobras to wood to make it look authentically cursed. If ancient Egyptians showed up at premieres, they'd probably roll their eyes. We wanted our grandkids to remember family play. You guys turned it into Indiana Jones's booby trap trigger. Historians still argue whether misrepresentations like these harm public understanding or whether they keep interest alive. Some scholars grumble that Hollywood's swamp fog of inaccuracies overshadows hard evidence. Others shrug, noting that most archaeologists alive today fell in love with Egypt precisely because of such pulp depictions. Maybe inaccuracy is the hook, accuracy comes later. Now sink into that plush film seat. The screen glows, a heroine solves a Senet puzzle by aligning pieces under moonlight. The soundtrack surges. An audience member whispers, "It's like chess." You chuckle under your breath. No, chess developed in India some 3,000 years later. But you don't spoil the moment. Cinema thrives on illusion. While Egyptian priests may once have prayed through dice throws, no real tomb collapsed because Lady X rolled the wrong stick. Yet Hollywood can't resist turning every Egyptian artifact into a device of peril. Here's a quirky aside. In one comic adventure film, Senet is played by mummies in an underworld casino, complete with dealers in jackal masks. You imagine dead kings groaning, "We carried this ceremonial ritual into eternity, and you turned it into slapstick Vegas." but it demonstrates the elasticity of myth. Once an image enters pop culture, it can be stretched endlessly. Think of board art itself. In movies, Senet boards gleam with impossibly detailed hieroglyphs, every square glowing ominously. In reality, most preserved sets are wood planks with neat lines, occasionally inscribed with 4 or 5 marked squares. Egyptian artistry was indeed stunning, but boards weren't neon-lit hazard maps. The exaggeration makes sense, visual storytelling demands drama. Still, it teaches the wrong lesson, that Egyptians thought of games as dangerous cosmic locks rather than social glue. Mainstream point again, in real tomb paintings, like Queen Nefertari's or Amenhotep's, you never see collapsing roofs, only calm figures quietly moving pawns. The vibe was meditative, not lethal. Death was serious enough, no need to add Hollywood's extra trapdoors. Yet even through distortion, Hollywood amplified fascination. By the late 20th century, replicas of Senet began surfacing in toy stores, fueled partly by Egyptomania triggered by films. Kids opened glossy boxes marked the actual pharaonic game, and played versions cobbled together from scholarly reconstructions and creative guesses. Accuracy was blurry, but the excitement was real. Cinema breathed new life into boards long left in museum winters. That, ironically, mirrors how Egyptians themselves revived games for new meanings across centuries. Historians still argue over pop culture's role. Did Hollywood cheapen sacred artifacts? Yes, sometimes. Did it inspire wildly misguided mystical claims, like Senet being Atlantean code puzzles? Absolutely. But did it also preserve public visibility for games long obscured behind glass? Unquestionably. Without movie mischief, Senet might have stayed academic dust. Let's indulge fringe speculation. Could movies themselves be seen as modern ritual boards? They arrange stories in linear sequences, with heroes moving perilous squares toward reward, misfortune, or death. That structure eerily mirrors the symbolic arc of Senet. So when Hollywood misrepresents Senet, it might unintentionally echo it, life as a series of fateful squares, chance determining leaps and plummets. Perhaps cinema and Senet share deeper DNA than either admits. Quirky comedic imagining, a 1950s movie set in a pharaoh's tomb, director yelling, "No, no, the pawn must glow brighter, it kills the hero." Meanwhile, a hired Egyptologist sighs, trying half-heartedly to explain rules to deaf ears. Actually, sir, it was, "Shut up, Professor, we need more curses." The scene plays in your head and you laugh. Experts groaning at producers is as eternal as gaming itself. Still, consider the resonance. Audiences leaving theaters may have mislearned details, but they carried home one correct impression: Egyptians played. Pharaohs weren't only entombed in solemn ritual, they laughed, competed, groaned over dice. Even through exaggeration, Hollywood communicated an essential truth: ancient people were mischievous and playful like us. As you leave the flickering cinema hall in your time-slip journey, you think about accuracy versus imagination. Egyptians painted themselves gaming to defy death. Victorian archaeologists shipped boards to Europe as puzzles. Hollywood projected them as cursed mechanisms. None of it is purely true, yet each layer extends Senet's survival. Games never die when stories refill them. Whether in a tomb, a trench, or on silver screen, pawns keep moving. The reels flutter silent, popcorn bags crumple. You step back into the moonlit Nile Road, smiling at how board games, of all things, became immortal not only through tombs but also through movie reels. The Egyptians may never have imagined it, but somewhere, you think, the goddess Atha is chuckling at her children's talent for turning anything solemn into a little play. You step out from the flickering glow of celluloid, leaving behind cursed movie pawns and crumbling Hollywood tombs. The night air returns you again to something quieter, something more personal. Imagine a circle of scholars sitting cross-legged on rugs in a Cairo apartment in the 1960s. Around them lies not treasure, not trapdoors, not cinematic exaggeration, but cardboard, wood, replicas, and handwritten rule notes scattered across tables. They're academics but also enthusiasts, trying desperately to answer the eternal question, how do you actually play Senet, or Mehen, or Hounds and Jackals? Tonight you join them on a carpet floor, watching reconstruction attempts unfold, painstaking, stubborn, and strangely childlike. Mainstream fact anchor, by the mid-20th century, serious Egyptologists like Timothy Kendall and R.C. Bell began reconstructing rules for Senet based on painted inscriptions in tombs and comparative analysis of game boards. They use textual references in the Book of the Dead, which describes squares as houses with meanings like House of Water, Danger, or House of Rebirth, Victory. They tried to correlate these with mechanics of movement. Their reconstructions varied wildly, but all shared one conclusion: Senet combined chance and strategy, with endgame squares as hurdles requiring exact rolls. So there you are, cross-legged, watching Kendall himself adjust pawns on a replicated board. He frowns, debates aloud, should a pawn stuck on square 27 require a specific throw? Or just repeat until freed? His colleague protests. They test variants, argue, scribble rules in margins, play until late hours. This is archaeology at its least glamorous yet most human, sweatshirts wrinkled, notes smudged, but laughter erupting when the wrong pawn drowns again. Now for a quirky tidbit, some of the first commercial recreations of Senet sold in the 1970s were radically inaccurate. One set marketed in the US included pawns shaped like Egyptian gods and dice cubes with glossy scarabs. Shoppers bought them eager to play like pharaohs. Then they discovered the rules printed in the box were mostly invented, borrowed loosely from backgammon. And yet, they still had fun. Those incorrect kits spread Senet into homes far outside academic circles. Egyptologists may have groaned, but families rolled happily on Sunday afternoons, oblivious that Osiris would not have approved. Historians still argue whether these reconstructions matter. Purists say false rules corrupt authenticity. Others argue that play itself, even inaccurate, fulfills the artifact's soul. What's more important, exact original rules or the survival of joy? The argument resembles Senet's final squares themselves, endlessly stuck between chaos and rebirth, replaying until consensus emerges. Let's add the personal touch. Imagine Timothy Kendall hunched late in his study in the 1980s at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, with one of Tutankhamun's sets in glass before him. He traces squares thoughtfully, then pulls out hand-carved pawns and tests sequences. Alone at night, he whispers to himself like a true gamer nerd, if piece A jumps square 26, does that mirror spell 333 of the Book of the Dead? He makes moves, then backtracks, resets, sighs. A scholar, yes, but also a guy just wanting to figure out rules so he can properly beat an opponent across millennia. Quirky aside, in the 1990s, some grad students at Cambridge were known to hold unofficial Senet nights. Beer, chips, reconstructed boards. Debates turned into playful competitiveness. They modified rules mid-game, added drinking penalties. Once again, Senet fused scholarship and play, exactly in Egyptian fashion. What was study also became fun. Meanwhile, Mehen wasn't ignored either. Archaeologists carved replicas of coiled serpent boards, complete with tiny lion pawns. They tested theories. Was it cooperative? Competitive? Did lions eat marbles? One trial version had lions racing to devour marbles at the snake's head, another had them move inward and race back out. Both produced chaotic laughter. Reconstruction here is less about certainty, more about exploring possibilities. Like playing a series of what-if stories with pawns as characters. Here's a fringe speculation that often excites reenactors. Some insist Mehen might have been played as a drinking game, each coil completed corresponding to a sip. And in at least one experimental archaeology group, that's exactly how they tested it. Let's just say outcomes blurred fast, but enthusiasm ran high. Whether historically accurate or not, modern smiles mirrored ancient nights. Mainstream scholarly debate remains sharp. Which reconstructed rules truly echo reality? Egyptologists compare patterns with Mesopotamian games, tracking probabilities. Some rule variants make gameplay too quick, others trap pawns endlessly, unlikely to have kept ancient players entertained. This process of trial and error mirrors the uncertainty of Section 3. Historians still argue whether players moved multiple pawns or just one, whether blocked pieces were skipped, whether captured pawns existed. But that open-endedness is precisely what makes recreation compelling. Now imagine yourself at one of these modern recreation circles. A replica Senet, hand-painted squares, reasonably accurate pawns. Across from you sits a scholar, pen in hand, eager to record data. You throw reconstructed sticks, land a 5, move your pawn triumphantly. Your rival sighs, scribbles observations, then grins wickedly with her next throw. Slowly, you forget history, museums, academia, you're just caught in the human joy of friendly contest. And that, paradoxically, is the closest you've ever been to Akhenaten or Nefertari. They too once lost track of eternity in laughter. Here's another quirky moment from archaeology's living room phase. A 2002 experiment had players test multiple rule sets, then rank them for fun factor. The most historically convincing version wasn't always the most enjoyable. Graduate students deliberately chose versions that seemed to create maximum suspense, even if archaeologically weaker. Isn't that perfect? Games survive not because they are accurate, but because they are fun. Likely even Egyptians modified rules when boredom struck. History repeats itself on carpet floors. Fringe speculation persists. Did ancient Egyptians also have house rules, passing slightly different versions from family to family? If so, then modern uncertainties aren't bugs, they're features. The multiplicity of reconstructions may actually reflect reality. Instead of one authentic Senet, there were dozens of authentic Senets. Now every modern player who improvises is simply echoing the tradition. Slow the moment again. Picture a desert sunset projected on a wall as background ambience. An Egyptology society hosts a Senet reenactment. Scholars sip tea, laugh softly, and compete under lamplight. They know they are wrong in some details, right in others. But the act itself resurrects the game. Pawns scrape gently, dice clatter faintly. With every round, ancient Egyptians live again, not as mummies on celluloid, but as people whose play threads through hands today. So you step back from that Cairo carpet floor, watching pawns line up one last time. The truth is undeniable. Modern recreations matter because they do what history has always done with games: transform them. Egypt's people adjusted Senet across centuries. Scholars and gamers are doing the same today. Authentic or not, every throw of reconstructed dice proves that the cultural heartbeat of Egyptian play is not entombed. It still beats, in classrooms, apartments, and societies rolling late into the night. And when the house lights dim after the last laugh, you realize the most faithful reconstruction of Senet may not be the most precise one. It is the one that makes strangers lean close, eyes bright, pawns sliding, and feel, again, the old rush of fate meeting play. You step away from that Cairo carpet floor of Section 16, the cigarette smoke, tea cups, and graduate students bickering over dice, and you blink into a very different glow, the pale, pulsing light of a computer screen. It's no longer the 1970s or 1990s. Now your company is keyboards, tablets, VR headsets, and audiophile headphones. The pawns are pixels, the sticks, algorithmic randomizers. Yet the board game of the pharaohs is alive again, shape-shifted into code. Tonight you wander through the new frontier, where Senet and Mehen drift inside smartphones, virtual reality headsets, and digital game platforms. Pharaohs may have prepared for eternity, but they never could have imagined appearing inside an app store. Anchor fact first, in the 21st century, multiple Senet reconstructions have been published not just in traditional academic journals but as playable digital simulations. Programmers, relying on scholarly models from Timothy Kendall and others, coded interactive Senet apps for PCs and mobiles, allowing anyone anywhere to throw digital sticks and race pawns. Several versions exist, some educational, some purely for fun. Museums like the Metropolitan Museum of Art partnered in creating online versions so visitors could play Pharaoh's favorite pastime after viewing artifacts in galleries. Thus, the digital age gave Senet its broadest ever audience. Millions more play it now in pixels than ever did on the Nile. Imagine a teenager on a bus in Seoul tapping pawns forward on a glowing square grid. Meanwhile, a retiree in Buenos Aires plays the same app, muttering about bad luck. Neither has ever touched real ivory cones, but they're part of the same lineage. Egypt's ghosts lean in, probably bemused. We invented this for afterlife insurance, you're playing it while commuting to work. Here's a quirky tidbit. In 2018, a VR developer recreated Tutankhamun's tomb complete with artifacts. In the middle sat a digital Senet board. Users could crouch, lift pawns, and play within reconstructed chambers. Tourists from New York wandered in VR goggles across gilded rooms, pawns clacking virtually. The solemn tomb guard would have fainted. Virtual Senet turned into a literal ghost game, alive only in a simulation. Historians still argue whether digitization risks further distorting ancient culture. Digital games often adopt simplified rules for accessibility. Squares might be mislabeled, pawns altered for clarity, AI opponent logic added. Purists worry these distortions mislead players into believing they're playing true Senet. Others argue distortion is survival. Without it, Senet risks sinking again into obscurity. Better a flawed digital echo than silence. Now sink into the sensory blend. You slip on a VR headset. Columns stretch around in dazzling 3D, star-painted ceilings overhead. A replica Nefertari sits across from you, her digital hands graceful as she tosses glowing sticks of fate. A narrator's voice whispers the meaning of each house square. The house of water threatens you. You reach for a pawn, fingers trembling as haptic gloves simulate texture. You slide the pawn. She smiles enigmatically. A digital ghost laughs as you lose. You rip off the headset giggling. It's a mix of awe and absurdity. Somehow eternity and 3D graphics just collided on your living room rug. Quirky aside, some indie game studios tinkered with fusing Senet mechanics into adventure video games. In one, exploring a tomb required challenging the Guardian in a full Senet set before passing. Beat the AI priest, or stay trapped. It's Hollywood deja vu, but now interactive. The difference is you can actually win through. A whole generation encountered Senet not in museums but as a minigame inside action titles, sandwiched between shooting skeletons and looting treasure. Another angle, digital communities formed around Senet. Online forums debate rule variants passionately, some citing archaeological sources, others proposing house tweaks. Kendall's model dominates too much luck, one player posts. Another insists, my version balances skill. Voila, history repeats. Animated avatars in Discord servers argue exactly like workers with clay grids once argued, only now via Wi-Fi. Historians still marvel at the irony. Senet, once a bridge to afterlife, now a digital bridge for strangers worldwide. If the ancients used it to commune with gods, we use it to commune with each other. Zoom meetings sometimes end with "Let's play Senet online." The gods might shrug, or maybe smile. They wanted us to keep moving pawns, after all. Here's another quirky tidbit. In 2021, an AI project trained on possible Senet variants learned strategies humans hadn't considered, sometimes winning much faster. Media dubbed it PharaohBot. Imagine, thousands of years after Egyptian artisans carefully carved ivory pawns, a machine learning model plays champion Senet against human fans. Pharaohs must be laughing. We thought we were gaming gods, now code does it better. Fringe speculation goes even further. What if digital simulation is the closest we've ever gotten to the afterlife model Egyptians imagined? Some techno-philosophers argue VR Senet is eerily close to a cybernetic rebirth, endless games, no death, replay forever. Isn't that a version of the Field of Reeds, an eternal place where play carries on without end? It may not involve Osiris weighing your heart, but it's still infinite leisure looped through code. Pull back for a breath. You picture ancient families huddled in mud brick homes with flickering torches, pieces of bone sliding across boards. Then shift to modern people in subway cars, headphones on, pawns tapping across phone screens. Millennia apart, the face is the same, squinted eyes, grins, sudden groans, hopeful mutters. Digital pixels replace ivory, but the instinct unbroken. Play rides history's currents better than language or empire. And so as you set your phone down or peel goggles from your eyes, you realize Senet has at last achieved the immortality Egyptians dreamed of. No longer limited to tombs, temples, or museum glass, it exists in billions of simulations, stored in invisible code, ready to reappear whenever anyone taps download. Pharaohs failed to keep their gold safe from thieves, dynasties collapsed, but their board game has survived every collapse and now lives in neon circuits everywhere. If immortality meant persistence far beyond your death, then ironically, the one tool Egyptians trusted casually for fun, the little board, outlived every monument. Senet on your tablet is Egypt's greatest ghost, still whispering through glowing squares. And the wildest part, we keep playing. Just as they hoped. The Nile night shimmers beneath your feet as you leave behind the glow of screens and virtual pawns to contemplate something broader. Board games in ancient Egypt, Senet in particular, were never just idle amusements. They served a function beyond laughter and rivalry. They were social glue, teaching tools, and vehicles of cultural continuity. Tonight, you think like an anthropologist, peering at how these ancient games held communities together, soothed conflicts, and mapped cosmic order onto everyday life. In essence, board games were a way Egyptians orchestrated social harmony and cosmic balance at once. Here's your firm anchor. Ancient Egyptian society revolved around the ideal of Mat, the principle of order, balance, and justice. Every action, whether grain harvest, law negotiation, or ritual chant, aimed to maintain this fragile equilibrium against chaos. Board games, with their precise rules, cycle of movement, wins, and losses, became miniature enactments of Mat. They taught respect for rules, patience, and acceptance of fate, all woven into social practice. Playing Senet or Mehen wasn't just entertainment, it was rehearsal for living harmoniously. Imagine two neighbors playing by the riverbank. Each move isn't just a step forward on a grid but a tacit contract. I respect the game's order, you respect mine. Even in disputes over moves, players negotiate social boundaries. Friendships hold because rules are clear. You realize the board turns chance to culture, and chaos to community. A quirky tidbit, some Egyptologists argue that Senet and other board games functioned as tools for conflict resolution. Instead of escalating quarrels over grain or land, villagers might settle tensions over a game. Winner takes the last sheaf wasn't uncommon as a wager. This repositions the game as a peaceful contest of luck and strategy to channel real-world rivalry into scripted, contained forms. The budding scholar in you admires the genius of using play to manage conflict. Historians still argue whether such conflict resolution was widespread or anecdotal, but the idea that games lubricate social friction resonates widely in anthropological literature on play worldwide. Egypt's great board games might have embedded mechanisms for diplomacy and respect beneath their sacred facades. Now, step into a communal scene. It's the Coolidge of evening. Families and friends have gathered with stone or wooden boards. Beer is shared freely, the scent of grilled fish fills the air. Laughter climbs above drone of conversation. Someone shouts, "You cheated!" The other grins back, "No, just better at fate." The social textures here are complex. Games build communal trust while allowing moments of rivalry and bravado. You catch a priest watching quietly from a distance, calmly approving or condemning the behavior. It's likely that ancient games had moral lessons inbuilt. Winners were gracious, losers humble. Remember that Egyptian obsession with Mat demanded justice and balance in all. Perhaps gameplay prepared people for ethical conduct, training patience and respect as much as competitive skill. A well-documented aspect of Egyptian social function concerns festivals, where communal gaming brought all social classes together. Elite nobles, priests, workers, and women could gather for nights of play. This collective amusement broke hierarchical tension temporarily. Everyone was subject to the throws of sticks, everyone experienced fortune's whims. Board games became egalitarian spaces where cosmic order and social unity intertwined under the desert stars. Quirky tidbit: some festivals combined gambling with religious ritual, making gaming both a spiritual and social event. Outside temple walls, beer flowed, dice flew, bets were made. Archaeologists find gaming boards among discarded beer jars at festival sites. The phrase "good luck" may have ancient origins in the hopeful throws cast under divine gaze. Historians still debate if the games also served educational purposes beyond leisure. By teaching children strategy, luck acceptance, and rule adherence, games shaped citizens ready to navigate social complexities. It's a subtle form of pedagogical soft power. Rather than lecturing, adults passed on cultural values through play. This type of cultural transmission, invisible but powerful, explains the enduring popularity of games like Senet across millennia. You picture a family group playing under date palms. The youngest pushes a pawn prematurely, mother smiles kindly but warns, "Wait your turn, respect the rules of fate." The father nods, rolling sticks carefully. Each move becomes a teaching moment, and a bonding ritual. Symbolically, every game session was a microcosm of Egyptian society, teaching cooperation and competition side by side under the timeless Nile sky. Let's pause for a sensory moment: the cool rustle of palm fronds, the clatter of dice, low voices chanting interpretations of squares, and the warm Nile breeze smelling of lotus blossoms. The game sounds alive, a ritual as natural as breathing. Fringe speculation links board games to cosmic order on a larger scale. Some researchers suggest that ancient priests saw gameplay as a metaphor not only for individual fate but for universal balance. Moving pawns across grids replicated the sun's path, stars' cycles, and gods' battles. Thus, the social harmony practiced in board games echoed the cosmic hierarchy itself. If a player failed to respect rules, they mirrored humanity's failure to honor Mat, with consequences in mythic and social realms. In that light, Senet wasn't just a game, it was a miniature world. Playing it was like holding the universe's design in your palm, negotiating chaos and order in a handful of pieces. It created social glue, taught patience, and inculcated reverence for fate. Through play, Egyptians shaped themselves not only to survive but to thrive in a deliberately ordered cosmos. As you rise from that imagined riverbank and the soft sounds of play fade into nighttime silence, you feel the weight of something profound. Games, simple in form, carried a civilization's deepest hopes and fears. Each clatter of dice was a prayer, each pawn moved a lesson. The Nile flowed eternal, and with it the eternal game, an echo from a distant past still replayed in hearts worldwide. You widen your gaze tonight, stepping beyond Egypt's lifeblood Nile Valley to consider how one civilization's game rippled across vast cultures and continents. Senet, Mehen, and related board games were not isolated curiosities but parts of a sprawling ancient family of play. You reach out toward China's liobua, India's parcheesi, and the Roman ludus latrunculorum, sensing echoes, parallels, and perhaps hidden conversations across time and space. Tonight, you thread together these distant cousins of Egyptian play culture, tracing how a shared human impulse to shape chance, fight fate, and bond socially crystallized in patterned squares everywhere. Firm anchor first, ancient board games carrying the spirit of Senet and Mehen appear across Eurasia from the 3rd millennium BCE. China's liubo, often called the game of 6 sticks, features distinctive grids and ritualized dice throws resembling Senet's use of luck mixed with strategy. Early examples date to 2300 BCE along the Yellow River, suggesting parallel or convergent development of games negotiating chance and order. While no direct borrowing from Egypt has been proven, these cultural cousins share thematic echoes of cosmic journey and fate's role. Moving westward, India's parcheesi, emerging later but rooted in deep antiquity, uses cross-shaped boards and cowrie shells as dice. It emphasized movement, blocking, and safe squares, much like Egyptian games. Parcheesi's legacy persists today in games like Ludo, proving the lasting appeal of royal race games. Its path of strategic racing balances luck and player choice as Senet did millennia before. Look further west, and Roman and Greek dice racing games, such as Ludus Latrunculorum and Duodecim Scripta, arise. Ludus Latrunculorum is often thought of as a war strategy game, but its dice and pawns navigating grid boards echo Egyptian race-style games structurally. Duodecim Scripta, a game of 12 lines, used 3 rows of 12 spaces, bearing a strong morphological resemblance to Senet's 3 rows but with a different rule set. Historians still argue about direct lineages or independent inventions. Did traders or soldiers carry Egyptian styles westward? Did Roman conquerors adapt Egyptian board game philosophy to their empire? Overlapping features are tantalizing but incomplete. The common denominator is humanity's urge to order randomness and dramatize fate through tactile play. Here's a quirky tidbit: some archaeological sites, like Pompeii, have been discovered with engraved boards on stone benches, suggesting public gaming was a frequent social pastime across the Roman world. Imagine the lively banter, the roll of dice, echoes of Egyptian-style play but now amid togas and amphitheaters. Play understood as a social ritual, shared but competitive, joyous but governed by rules. These echoes form a vast network beyond Egypt's original banks. Fringe speculation proposes that all these Eurasian race games originated from a much older protogame culture that spawned variants as trade and ideology moved. Some suggest a Bronze Age board game culture where the metaphysics of fate and movement extended from Egypt across Asia and Europe. It's an ambitious view, sparking lively debate, but it emphasizes human universality in play conceptions. Focus on symbolic themes. Central to Egyptian games was the journey metaphor, pawns representing souls navigating perils towards safe rebirth. In many other traditions, race games similarly symbolize pilgrimage, spiritual ascent, or struggles between order and chaos. Parcheesi's safe zones, liubo's ritual contexts, and even Roman gambling games share these narrative depths. Board games become cosmological models woven into society's fabric. Imagine sitting in a multicultural gathering in a Mediterranean port town. Egyptian merchants play Senet, Greek sailors roll duodecim scripta sticks, Canaanites mock parcheesi. They share laughter, bets, and stories. Despite language gaps, their overlapping games create a common communal ground. Board games, as much as language or religion, become cultural bridges across complicated frontiers. Historians continue to map these relationships, noting that while Egyptian Senet remained fundamentally a race game linked with afterlife ritual, other cultures evolved the form with new mechanics. That flexibility ensured survival. Packaged differently, mutated by local beliefs, Egyptian-style games provided broad templates yet left room for invention. It's a dynamic, living heritage. You reach toward the next step in this chain, how these ancient ideas echo in modern board games. Chess, the most popular, emerged centuries after these traditions but owes lineage to race and strategy games. Even Monopoly or Clue carry echoes of structured movement, luck, and social interplay. By tracing Senet's distant ripples, you glimpse the deep human fascination with manipulating chance, enforcing rules, and competing within friendly bounds. In a quiet moment sipping tea, you consider how these ancient boards united civilizations through shared ritualized play, a language unspeaking yet universally understood. Each roll of dice was a whispered prayer, every pawn slide, an act of hope against fate's unpredictability. How remarkable that humanity's oldest board game, carved by Egyptians 5 millennia ago, still pulses faintly beneath the tiles of games we casually play today. As you gaze once more at the still Nile water, you see in its reflected stars the endless human story of play, an eternal game of chance, strategy, and connection stretching from ancient riverbanks through empires and centuries. The journey that began with carved squares and tossing sticks continues now in every game played, every pawn nudged forward, and every joyful groan of defeat and laughter of victory. The Nile's soft murmur fades into the background as the story you've traveled through rolls gently toward its final squares. From riverbank leisure to royal tomb treasures, from temple stones to cinematic fantasies, from clay scratchboards to glowing digital apps, you've seen how ancient Egyptian board games persist, shimmering like phantom echoes across millennia. Now, in this last stretch of our journey, you rest beside the Nile, reflecting on what those simple carved grids teach us about human culture, continuity, and play itself. Here's the anchor point. Modern board games owe a profound debt to the ancient archetypes born in Egypt. Scholars and enthusiasts widely recognize Senet as the world's oldest known board game, a pioneering template where structured movement, strategy, and chance combine. Senet's core mechanics, racing pawns across spaces based on random throws, managing obstacles, and navigating fate, survive in countless modern games, from backgammon and Parcheesi variants to racing games like Ludo and Parcheesi. Its pattern of social competition blended with ritual meaning laid foundational groundwork in human play history. You think of how modern players clutch dice, plot tactical moves, count spaces, unknowingly echoing game nights by the Nile 5,000 years ago. In a subtle way, every modern board recreates an ancient dance between skill and chance the Egyptians formalized with sticks and squares. Now, look deeper at Senet's cultural significance. For Egyptians, the game was never a mere pastime. It blurred lines between leisure, spirituality, and social pedagogy. Modern games, no matter how complex or flashy, rarely stitch myth and community so tightly. Senet was both game and prayer, profession and playground, cosmic model and kitchen pastime. That synthesis is rare, and it's why Egypt's games hold a special, almost mythic status in human history. Imagine holding a beautifully crafted Senet set, painted in lapis lazuli and gold leaf, feeling the smooth relief of carved squares, tracing the subtle hieroglyphs marking fate's threats and rescues. You're holding not just a game, but a portal to Egyptian philosophy, acceptance, patience, resilience, and perhaps above all, hope. Every jump forward, every setback, is a moment mirrored in the human spirit, our endless gamble with fortune. A quirky tidbit, modern game designers openly acknowledge Egyptian influences. Some board game historians argue that Senet's blend of chance and strategy inspired future legends like chess's ancestors, or even the psychological tension in contemporary board games built around dice rolls and tactical movement. Designers of new historical or educational board games often cite Egypt's Game of Passings as an early blueprint for their creations. The Nile's ancient players laid a foundation still referenced in hobbyist circles, game theory, and cultural narratives. Historians continue to debate the exact lineage between Senet and later European race games like backgammon. Some argue direct influence, others suggest convergent evolution, yet the shared elements are striking. Egyptian hieroglyphs inscribed on board squares, House of Water, House of Rebirth, show a deep infusion of morality and soteriology into game design, a feature modern games seldom replicate with such spiritual density. Now a modern sensorial image, family board nights around a glowing lamp, dice tossed, pieces moving across familiar grids. The room spills over with laughter, groans, and light jabs. The players don't realize they're tugging at threads woven 5,000 years ago, when craftsmen carved grids into ivory and kings prayed to Osiris mid-game. This continuity is humbling and comforting. Play is eternal, timeless, bridging epochs in small clacks and cheers. Fringe contemplation brightens the final path. Some anthropologists argue that the sacred origins of board games like Senet hint at a deeper human need. Play isn't trivial, it's a ritualized rehearsal of life, death, and cosmic order. Egyptians made visible the invisible forces, chance, luck, fate, through play. And by doing so, they offered a small mastery over chaos, if only on a board. In our modern games, whether serious or silly, we trace the same yearning, to shape randomness, to test ourselves, to find community in competitive fun. You recall the serpent's coil of Mehen, the social sparkle of festival beer and gaming women, the solemn temple steps where stupefied guards scratched innermost boredom into the stone. From the crass commercial replica sold in Victorian England to the screen's exaggerated mystical boards to the sleek digital versions on phones, Senet refused to die. It adapted, copied, corrupted, and survived. Play is the highest form of research, said Albert Einstein, and you realize Egyptians intuitively grasped this too. By turning fate into a game, they learned, rehearsed, laughed, and faced their most profound fears. Their boards were classrooms of eternity, tablets of fate, and tools of joy wrapped into one. You're glad that tiny ivory cones clash still, that sticks still fall, that laughter still blends bewilderment with delight. As you lie with the sound of the Nile washing overnight, you sense the silent collaboration across ages. The human game continues, players past, present, and future moving pawns together. The ancient minds who first carved those lines in mud and stone look on approvingly. The game never stops, it rolls on beyond tomb walls, beyond empires, beyond time itself. Now the Nile night deepens. Quiet descends. You feel your eyes close, drifting softly down the river of history, carried by the eternal game and the flicker of chance's endless dance. As the quiet waters of the Nile softly ripple beneath the moon's gentle glow, your thoughts ease into calm reflection. The journey through ancient Egypt's world of board games is winding down, but the echoes of those painted boards, carved grids, and rolling sticks linger like distant music. Senet, that humble yet profound game, was never just a pastime. It was a mirror of life itself, at once playful and sacred, simple and profound, mortal and eternal. You have seen how Egyptians carried Senet from sunlit courtyards to the shadowy tombs of kings. How it became a bridge between this life and the afterlife, a sacred rehearsal for the soul's journey. Yet, you also glimpse the laughter of children racing pebbles, the kindness and teasing passed between family members, the quiet contemplation of priests, and even the roaring fun beneath festival torches. The game was woven tightly into culture, spirituality, sociality, the very fabric of being. Play was more than entertainment, it was a language through which Egyptians shaped order from chaos, taught patience and cunning, faced fate with courage. Each throw of the sticks was both chance and conversation with gods, each pawn's advance a step toward rebirth. And though the exact rules faded into history's sands, the spirit of the game never died. Today, Senet still lives, in recreated boards, smartphone apps, virtual reality, and countless game nights uniting friends and strangers alike. It whispers to us across millennia that play is timeless, humanity's enduring attempt to make sense of uncertainty through joy and connection. So, as you drift towards sleep, let the steady rhythm of those ancient dice rolls soothe your mind. Remember, life is a game of chance and choice, loss and triumph, just as it was by the Nile long ago. Your journey has ended, but the game rolls on. Good night.